Okay, so can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. So yeah, there's 4 question types on the FRQs. You should all know that by now, but let's go over them real quick. Concept application, scenario-based question. They'll give you some sort of political scenario, and basic question about what can Congress do, what can the courts do. If you look in your packet, if you haven't been through one of these sessions before, there's a bunch of really helpful information starting on page 98 that deals with that particular type of question. So I don't want to really dwell on it too much for this session, just to remind everybody what the question types are. And you can go through and look at them on your own. But the most important thing about the concept application question is you have to mention the scenario. You have to mention, hang on a second, okay, too much. There we go, might be a little better. You have to mention the scenario. If you don't mention the scenario, you're not going to get the points, at least for part B and C. So just make a note of that. Also, in each of these question types, you want to use examples if you have a task that says to explain or describe. And a strategy that I would recommend very strongly is literally when you get the exam and the answer sheets, as a pre-write, just write the word "for example," just as a reminder, because that language is what graders look for, and obviously you want to try to have an example that makes sense. But if you look at the way these are worded in the sample responses, you can get a sense of what a good response looks like. So just remember, for the concept application, reference the scenario. Use examples if you're trying to explain something. Okay, the second question type is quantitative, which is a graph or an infographic. Again, those are pretty basic. The same rules apply. If you're asked to compare. If you're asked to draw a conclusion, that's a little more in-depth. And then if you're asked to explain something, once again, try to use that for example literal wording, and then obviously an example that ties it in. Third question type is Supreme Court comparison questions. In the back of your packet, starting on page 104, page 106, you have all of the cases summarized for you. At this point in your preparation, you should already have a pretty good understanding what the cases are, but in case you need a little bit more reminding, there's the basic issue and the significance, the constitutional principle in the third column there, and then the clauses. It is critically important that you get the correct clause. If you're talking about Engel versus Vitale and you mentioned the free exercise clause, that's incorrect. You will not get the point for that, okay? So that is an establishment clause case. You just have to know that. So make use of that reference. If you were in the after-school sessions, I kind of did some predicting as far as looking at past exams. In the past 2 years, they have asked about Brown versus Board of Education twice. So I don't think they're going to ask about it again, but then again, who knows? Could literally be any of the 15 cases. My money is on Citizens United as a case to extra prepare for. Also the Schenck case, Schenck versus United States. McDonald versus Chicago is probably a good one to look at too, because it's a tie into selective incorporation. But it could be any of them. And once again, on a Supreme Court comparison case, and you'll want to make a note of this, you have to mention the facts of the case that you're expected to know. It doesn't get you any points if you just regurgitate facts from the case that they provide you, because they're going to give you a bunch of facts from a case that you have not been exposed to, and that doesn't get you any points. So, it has to reference them, obviously, but you want to make sure that you put in the questions that the facts of the case that you're supposed to know. And then the fourth question type is probably the most important, and that is the argumentative essay. And the argumentative essay, the single most important thing, and this is another thing that I would literally do make a note of it so you remind yourself. The minute you get your FRQ packet, write the word because. Just write it down as a reminder, not joking. Because if you don't have a line of reasoning in your thesis statement for your argumentative essay, you are setting yourselves up to only get 1 out of 6 points. You have to have a line of reasoning. So if you're asked to defend, write an essay that would, make an argument on whether the filibuster rule should be suspended so that legislation can be passed. Okay, so if that's your task, then you would say, I believe, or actually, I lie. Avoid first person. That's one of my things. I misspoke. The filibuster rule has been around since the founding era. It is critical for fostering, the minority point of view or whatever it is. So therefore, the filibuster rule should be preserved because it is fundamental to democratic principles or whatever. Okay, but that word "because" is where you set up the rest of your essay. So just again, as a test-taking strategy, make use of that device. So write the word "because," and then when you draft your thesis statement, obviously remember a couple other things about how to write these FRQs. Use paragraphs and spacing that make it easy to understand your answer. So if there's 3 tasks that you're asked to write about A, B, and C, write a paragraph for each one with spacing in between. For the argumentative essay, there should be 4 distinct sections. One is your thesis statement and line of reasoning. The second is your first piece of evidence and a line of reasoning. The piece of evidence has to be relevant. It has to be accurate. Okay, so if you're talking about Federalist 10 and you're talking about, an independent judiciary, that's inaccurate. Okay, Federalist 10 is about, Madison and faction is unavoidable, but you can deal with it with a large republic. So that's, so make sure that you're accurate, relevant. Third paragraph for your second piece of evidence and line of reasoning, or your reasoning statement, and then the most important thing and the single most missed part of the argumentative essay is this concession rebuttal section. You have to have a concession and rebuttal section. So present the contrarian point of view, okay? If you're arguing that the filibuster rule should be preserved, then in the rebuttal concession statement, you want to talk about how, gridlock, some might argue that because of gridlock and hyperpolarization, it is necessary to get rid of the filibuster so that legislation can get passed, and then you refute that, why that's a bad idea or whatever, if that's what you believe, okay? Okay, so those are the 4 question types. I just wanted to make sure that we have some basic reminders and strategies. Again, my very strong recommendation is that when you get your packet, literally write the word "for example" just as a reminder so that you use that anytime you see a task to explain. If the task is identify, all you have to do, identify the clause associated with Engel versus Vitale. Okay. You could literally write the establishment clause, and you're going to get credit. Okay. I'm not supposed to tell you that, but try to write a complete sentence. You want to have good writing style and everything like that, but that's really the truth. Okay. At this point, we're going to start looking at the actual outline, starting on page 3. And with a group this size, I guess if you have questions, let's raise our hands and stuff like that, and I will certainly try to answer and accommodate as many questions as we can. But basically today, we're going to plow through the entire course as quickly as we can. We'll take a break in about an hour, and then what do you need? Oh, I'm out. Sorry, I have to look on with somebody else at this point. I had like 300 of those made. I don't know where they all went. Literally. Okay, so let's start with if you need scratch paper, I got paper up here if you need that. But okay, and everybody understand the answer key is up here if you need it. Just come up and get it at your leisure. And by the way, I realized after creating the answer key that I put the wrong practice exam in the review packet. So there's a lot of repeat questions, but oh well, it is what it is at this point. So anyway, it'll be fine. All right, so let's start off with Unit 1, and the outline that we're looking at is the College Board outline. Now, before we go any further, remember that there's what I call the College Board outline, which is literally what the College Board published as, the essential information you have to know. And you can take it to the bank. If it's not on the College Board outline, it's not going to be tested, okay? If it is on the College Board outline, it almost certainly will be tested in some form or another, okay? Obviously, they can't test every single solitary thing, but everything's fair game, okay? The second part of this outline, starting on page 34, is the material that I wrote. And those of you that had me in class as your teacher, as I'm sure I've reminded you, this is all stuff that I wrote. It's stuff that should sound pretty familiar. I try to use the consistent examples that I use in class. But this is the more detailed accounting of all the stuff that you're supposed to know in the main outline. And it's unit by unit. If you still have your red and blue packets, it corresponds pretty much with what's in there. But it's designed to be a last-minute review. So tomorrow, I wouldn't recommend stressing out too much about this exam, but, if you have some time, wouldn't be a terrible idea to read through it one last time, just as a reminder. Okay. All right, so with that, let's go. The first enduring understanding on page 3 is a balance between governmental power and individual rights has been a hallmark of American political development. And the topic is the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so the Declaration of Independence is the very first thing we studied in this course, and I would just remind you that the basic principles in the preamble are really important to know, and you can see them there: natural rights, popular sovereignty, republicanism, and probably the most important thing to understand is the social contract. If you read the actual preamble, there's language in there that indicates that revolution is a pretty extreme thing, and they talk about, should not change your government for light and transient causes. But the whole body of the Declaration, if you remember, was really a list of things that the King of England had done that were just, in the mind of the colonists, unforgivable. Due process violations, excessive taxation, military intimidation. You might recall that the Quartering Act was a thing, and the whole reason we have the Third Amendment, which prohibits quartering of soldiers, is because that was something that was done to kind of intimidate the people. Okay, so the Declaration, again, based on this idea of natural rights and publicly asserting that the social contract had been broken. Of course, they don't say that in language, but, if you remember the language of the Declaration, when a long train of abuses and usurpations have blah, 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 they basically say, okay, it's time, okay? All right, so just remember the Declaration is not just, declaring independence. It's also a very detailed accounting of all of the complaints about the way the colonies were being treated. Okay. And also, obviously, the idea of popular sovereignty is important. So make sure you know what that means, the idea that the people are ultimately sovereign, not any government. Okay. Very, very important on page 3, participatory, pluralist, and elite. If you look at the material in your packet, there's later on in the unit summaries, there's a lot of information on examples that tie into each type of government. So participatory is exactly what the name implies. Write in your notes, the House of Representatives is the closest thing we have to a participatory model of government within the Constitution. Most of the Constitution, it's kind of surprising when people hear this, most of the Constitution is more aligned with the elite model, the way the president's selected, the way the judges are selected, the way senators were originally selected, not by the people. So if it's not by the people, that's more of elitism, okay? Pluralism is really the Madisonian idea of this marketplace of ideas. We see pluralism play out when we talk about interest groups, and later in Unit 5 when we get into super PACs and all that stuff, that's consistent with pluralism. And pluralism is really based on the idea that there is a competition that exists, and preferably there's compromises that are reached, and the best ideas are the ones that win out. Also, very, very important in Unit 1, Federalist 10 and Brutus 1. These are opposite arguments, one in favor of federalism. Federalist 10 is the idea that, and this should be, you should all know this by now, but I'm going to repeat it one more time. Faction is what? Inevitable, but controllable, manageable, okay. You can manage faction with a large republic. Okay, so take that to the bank. That is very good to know. Madison was of the belief that it's desirable to have, if you don't have faction, something's wrong, because again, Madison goes into great length in Federalist 10 talking about how, you know, you could try to eliminate faction, but doing so results in, you know, taking away basic freedoms. And, you know, that can be achieved through forcing people to have the same idea or propaganda or something like that. And of course, those are things that we reject as Americans, or at least hopefully. Okay, Brutus 1 was exactly the opposite point of view. A couple things that you want to make a note of with Brutus 1. Brutus 1 was especially alarmed at the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause. The necessary and proper clause says Congress shall make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. That is about as broad a language as you can get. And the anti-federalists, these were the ones that were also, you know, responsible for the first Constitution, which was a confederacy. We started as a confederacy because we were so fearful of federal power. And so they thought that having this, you know, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper, plus the supremacy clause, which means that if they do make a law, it's superior to anything the states are doing. So this is pretty alarming for the anti-federalists. They also were of completely the opposite point of view with regard to the utility of a large republic. They thought a large republic would lead to corruption. So that needs to go in your notes. Corruption and people who were seeking self-aggrandizement and self-enrichment as opposed to people who are truly wanting to serve the people. In contrast, Federalist 10, if you actually read the thing, presented the argument that a large republic is also desirable because, you know, for lack of a better description, you get a better talent pool. You get more people, and you're going to get a better quality set of representatives because there's more of them and they will compete with each other and on and on. So these are completely opposite points of view. Okay, the next enduring understanding, the Constitution emerged from the debate about the weakness of the Articles of Confederation as a blueprint for limited government. All right, and you can see there Federalist 10 and Brutus 1 again. Articles of Confederation is almost, you know, we didn't really read the thing, which is probably, I'm not going to apologize for not going into, because honestly, every time they've tested on the Articles of Confederation, it's what led to its demise. Okay, just a quick reminder. The Articles of Confederation created a weak, decentralized government where there was virtually no power afforded to the national government. They didn't have the power to tax. They didn't have the power to borrow money. They couldn't raise armies. They couldn't coin money. It was just a loose collection of states kind of thinly held together. And of course, that is problematic if you have a national emergency that pops up that you have to deal with. And of course, Shays' Rebellion is the single most often, in fact, I would almost go so far as to say the only thing they ever test about with relation to the Articles of Confederation. It was a tax revolt, and the government just simply didn't have any way to deal with that militarily. They had to rely on state-funded mercenary groups to put it down. So that was, you know, so basically there was a realization from early on that the Articles was unworkable, okay? And then we had the Constitutional Convention, and the single most important thing to remember about the Constitutional Convention was to deal with the differences of opinion on how the states should be represented. Some wanted population-based, some wanted, you know, equal representation. They decided to, you know, go with both of them. And bicameralism really serves a couple of purposes. One, it satisfies that debate between, you know, should the states be represented equally because that's not fair to the large states, or should they be represented proportionally where the large states have an advantage? Well, splitting the two, not only do you get the compromise, but you also, if you remember from Federalist 51, this also serves as another example of checks and balances. You make it harder for the legislature to operate because Madison believed that the legislature is where most policymaking would come from. I think the idea of judicially imposed, activism and, cases like Roe versus Wade would be quite puzzling to the founders because they believed policies like that would come from the legislature. Okay. The couple other compromises that you need to know about, the 3/5 compromise was a compromise that dealt with slavery. The inclusion of Article 5, it's interesting that I haven't looked at the actual College Board outline in a while, but that is something that you need to know about. A lot of you missed that on the practice question test we just had. You have to know each article of the Constitution, at least the basics. Okay, Article 5 is the amendment process. The compromise that was reached in Article 5 was to have two different methods of amending the Constitution. One is through Congress. 2/3 of the House and the Senate have to propose an amendment, okay? But the second one was a concession to the anti-federalists. This is really important to get in your notes. The second method of amending the Constitution permits the states completely by themselves, provided they can get 2/3 of the states on board. So it's this, today that would be 34 states. If you can get 34 states to agree to a constitutional amendment, they can propose an amendment completely by themselves without any input from Congress whatsoever. This is an important check, and if you get who knows what they're going to ask on the FRQs, but if you get a question about the amendment process, it is really important to make a note of the fact that this was also a concession, a major concession to the anti-federalists. Because a lot of people complain about the federal government, we can't do anything, blah, blah, blah. Well, there is within the Constitution the ability by the states, by themselves, to alter the Constitution. That's pretty important because we oftentimes think of government and we think of Washington, D.C. and all these bureaucrats and we can't really do anything. Well, built into the Constitution is a way to, radically transform the government if we so chose. It just has never been done before. There's never been a constitutional convention of the states. If there was one, I don't even know what they would talk, probably term limits or something like that for Congress might be a budgetary amendment, who knows. But. Okay, let's move on. Top of page 5 is where I'm at. And by the way, let's look at the sample questions as we go. In the page 4, practice question. In the 1780s, proponents of the new Constitution cited Shays' Rebellion as an example in support of which of the following criticisms of the national government under the Articles of Confederation? And I think most of you know this, should be an easy one. The lack of national military power to address security concerns is going to be your answer on that one. Okay. Top of page 5. The debate over the role of the central government, powers of state governments, the right of individuals remains at the heart of present-day constitutional issues about democracy and power, as represented by debates about government surveillance resulting from the 9/11 attacks, debate about the role of the federal government in public school education. Okay, so one of the themes of the course is liberty versus order, okay? We just went through a worldwide pandemic that I think put this balance between liberty and order on full display worldwide. In our country, it's, for some people somewhat alarming when you see governments forcing people to do this or that, take vaccines or put on masks or whatever the deal may be. But those are all tensions. Back when this outline was written, this obviously pre-pandemic, after 9/11, when there's a big emergency like that, people want to do something. So, and if you're wondering what they're referring to in that outline, the Patriot Act allowed unprecedented surveillance of suspected terrorists. There was a law it wasn't a law, there was a policy put in place that Americans didn't even know about until Edward Snowden revealed it, that the government was logging all of our cell phone detail with, metadata without even telling people. Fourth Amendment violation, anybody? Right? So those are things that, you always have to balance. We want to prevent terrorism. We want to prevent, the spread of disease or whatever. But there's also at some point, the individual interest that has to be weighed as well. Okay, next, enduring understanding. The Constitution created a competitive policymaking process to ensure the people's will is represented and that freedom is preserved. Explain the constitutional principles of separation of powers and checks and balances. Okay, this is getting into Federalist 51. And again, you have to know the Federalist Papers. So Federalist 51, all about separation of powers and checks and balances. I have preached in my classes the utility of chunking these Federalist Papers. Federalist 51 is mostly aligned with what you'll find in Article 1 of the Constitution. Article 1 of the Constitution has a bicameral Congress. That's a check on the power of the legislature. It makes it more difficult to do stuff. There's also the requirement that legislation be presented to the president in Article 1, Section 7. There's also the requirement or the possibility of a presidential veto. Those are all checks and balances. So that's all, again, discussed in Federalist 51. Explain the implications of separation of powers and checks and balances. Now, this is one I want you to, if you have a highlighter, this is time to get one out, because this is something that a lot of people missed on the last practice exam we did in my class. And it's this one that it's just, at the first read, it's kind of like, what are they talking about? Multiple access points for stakeholders and institutions to influence public policy flows from the separation of powers and checks and balances. Okay. In the system of federalism, what they mean by multiple access points, if you want to change a policy, you can go through your local government, you can go through your state government, you can go to a city council meeting, you can go to a school board meeting, okay? You can write a letter to your congressperson. You could file a lawsuit locally. You could file a federal lawsuit. You could contact your federal representative or your senator. You could even create an advertisement, trying to convince the President of the United States to do something. There's so many access points. That's what we mean by access points. Stakeholders are those who have an interest in policy, that want a certain policy enacted. So lobbyists are stakeholders. If you're a big pharmaceutical company, you probably were very busy during the pandemic trying to, get the government to approve emergency use authorizations and all of the stuff that went along with that. So stakeholders are simply people who have an interest in a policy outcome. Okay, so that's a really important one. It showed up on a multiple choice exam, and it just sounded, people, I think, just didn't understand what the question was talking about. But that's what that means. There's just, in a system of federalism, there's a lot of opportunities to influence policy. Okay, impeachment, removal, and other legal actions taken against public officials deemed to have abused their power reflect the purpose of checks and balances. Again, last year there was a question about impeachment. It was one of the FRQs, and it was an argumentative essay deciding whether or not impeachment was, even effective. And it's probably worth noting there has never been a president removed from office through impeachment. There's been 4 impeachments. I think, post, and by the way, in every instance, there's politics involved, okay? I am of the opinion that, the Bill Clinton impeachment was probably a big mistake because it was, and I know this is before your time, but I lived through it, it was driven by anger. People were angry at Bill Clinton, and the hyper-polarization era that we're living through right now really, I don't want to get into the Bill Clinton impeachment, but I mean, they went after it was awful. They proved, the incident, and it was bad. But and then to impeach him, if you're wondering what the Clinton impeachment for, it was perjury, and he was sued by a woman named Paula Jones, accusing him of sexual harassment, and they needed to prove a pattern of similar behavior. That's when the Lewinsky thing was exposed. Okay, so impeaching someone for that, a lot of people are like, why are we even doing that? And then, of course, the Trump impeachments, some people are still scratching their heads about what that was all about. There's no question that was a lot of anger and a lot of resentment. So impeachment, if I had to make an argument, it is so difficult to remove a president from office. It really should be reserved for the absolute most egregious sort of behavior. And I have a feeling that it's, in recent decades, it's kind of been cheapened a little bit. That's my opinion, but anyway. So, if you want to make an argument, obviously it's a possibility. The standard for impeachment, by the way, if you're wondering, is high crimes and misdemeanors. And like a lot of things in the Constitution, that is a vague standard. You can make that, transform it into anything you want it to be. Okay. The next one, federalism reflects the dynamic and distribution of power between national and state governments. Okay, so there's some important stuff here that we'll get into with, and this is where we get into categorical versus block grants. That's something that you definitely need to know. Categorical grants are money flowing to the states with strings attached. My go-to example is right here where we're standing, the lunchroom. The food that they serve has to be very strictly in adherence with federal guidelines. Caloric requirements, sugar content, things like that are regulated. If the school starts serving things that are out of alignment with that and they get audited and they get caught, they have the risk of losing that funding. So that is an example of not only a categorical grant, but also potentially a condition of aid where the money is conditioned upon following the guidelines. Okay, block grants are examples where the federal government typically gives money for a defined purpose. My go-to example is transportation budgets, where there's so much variance, but big cities like New York City and Boston and Washington, D.C., most people get around by subways. They don't have to spend money on massive freeway infrastructure projects like we do here in Houston. I've also used the example of snow removal. That's not even a part of the budget at all in southern states, and yet it's a major expense in cities like Minneapolis and stuff like that. So rather than try to micromanage, block grants makes more sense. They'll give the money in a chunk and say, here's your transportation budget, you figure it out. One policy area that is frequently tested is welfare reform. In the 90s, prior to the 90s, welfare reform was usually distributed in the form of food stamps, literal, almost like cash. And they had denominations on them, and it was very easy. And I used to work at a grocery store. I'm sure I've told you this story before, but I would see people every day come up, pay with food stamps. They'd have a $50 denomination food stamp, buy $35 worth of stuff, have $15 left over, and then they buy it on stuff that wouldn't qualify for food stamps, alcohol, cigarettes, things like that. So lots of possibility of fraud. So to combat that in the 90s, they decided, you know what, let's see if there's a better idea. So the states were given the ability to administer welfare using block grants. Okay, so transformation from categorical to block grants, that's called devolution. Devolution, write it in your notes. When the states are given more flexibility in how to carry out a policy, that's what devolution is. Now, there's two court cases that are associated with Unit 1 and federalism, and that is McCulloch versus Maryland and U.S. versus Lopez. McCulloch versus Maryland is the case that explored whether or not the United States has the power to create a bank. Obviously, the answer was yes. We have the Fed. Okay, so you guys, not to bring back echoes of economics class, but we have this national banking system. It was used based on the implied powers. The way it works, the necessary and proper clause says Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. So, does Congress have the power to create a bank? Well, not explicitly, no. But it is necessary and proper for Congress to create a bank to carry out its enumerated power to coin and regulate money. So that's how you get to the power to create a bank. It's an implied power. This was probably the worst fears realized of the anti-federalists because it basically gave credence to this idea that the government can do things that are out of the bounds of the Constitution, seemingly. And when they do so, the Supremacy Clause kicks in, and the states cannot, pass laws to the contrary. So McCulloch versus Maryland, and I've given you this tip in the after-school sessions, but I'm going to give it again in case you missed those. They always test this question, this case, based on trying to confuse you with the other M case, Marbury versus Madison, okay? Of the following, which case resulted in judicial review? And the first choice will be McCulloch versus Maryland, okay? Just avoid making that, elementary mistake. It's something that, you should be able to sort out, but just be aware for that and be on the watch for that. The other federalism case is United States versus Lopez. Now, in your packet, if you read the detailed unit summaries, I go into great length talking about the expansion of power of the Commerce Clause. There is frequently questions on the AP exam that basically ask the question, which of the following is the constitutional basis, or which power is the constitutional basis for various things? If it's anything having to do with any kind of regulation, it's the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause has been expanded, and the understanding of commerce is so broad that virtually any kind of regulatory action is permissible under the Commerce Clause. Lopez presented an opportunity. It's the first since the court started to limit what constitutes commerce. And if you don't remember the Lopez case, the gun-free school zones law, which was a federal law that made it illegal to possess a gun in a school zone, despite the fact that there were already state laws to the same effect. It was some, feel-good federal law. They're trying to do something about gun violence or whatever. And the court looked at that, and basically what happened is the state prosecutors declined to prosecute. They said, you guys can deal with it, feds. If you got your new law, you do it. We'll save the money. And the defense was, the guy didn't claim he didn't bring a gun to school. I don't know what kind of gun it was, but the defense was, where does Congress have the power to regulate guns in a school zone? And if you remember this case, it was almost kind of entertaining if you look at the details of the case, because they would make these tortured arguments of how, possession of a gun could lead to, economic, hardship or whatever. If they're afraid of guns in school, and by the way, this is all pre-Columbine, this is before all the school shootings and stuff. I'm not trying to diminish, obviously, but if the kids are afraid of guns in school, then they won't perform as well in school, and then that'll hurt the economy. And so they're trying to make this tortured argument how it's going to affect interstate commerce somewhere down the future. And I just can picture Scalia or Thomas, who were in the room when this case was decided, looking at this and like, I don't get it. How is that commerce? And so basically the law was struck down 5-4. It was a close ruling, but 5-4 ruling, they said the court really doesn't have, or the Congress doesn't have this authority. So it was the first time in years that Congress had actually limited the power to regulate under the Commerce Clause. Okay, and once again, explain how the distribution of powers among the federal branches, and look at this one more time. This is not a misprint. This is from the College Board outline. Multiple access points for stakeholders and institutions to influence policy flows from the allocation of powers between the national and state governments. So they really want you to know that. So just keep in mind, part of federalism is lots of opportunities for political engagement. All right, let's look at the question on page 6. We went over this in class, but if you haven't heard it in a while, this question is an example of some of the absurdities on the AP exam, okay? I want you to look at this question. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1985 authorized the government. Now, first of all, before you go any further, just think, did we ever talk about that? No. They know that. This is like, what? So if you're reading that, there's two words that should pop out at you: budget and tax. Tax deductions for employer health care plans, blah, 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 blah. Okay, and then it goes, which enumerated power allowed Congress to make the law? All right. Here is where, and you're going to get a question like this, all right? And if you use the strategy that I'm going to tell you, it becomes incredibly simple. The magic word in this is tax and budget, 2 words. Your choices are regulating commerce among the states. Now, and the reason that this question appears where it is in the outline is because most students are going to choose that one, and they're going to get it wrong. Because this is not a regulatory measure. The omnibus budget, blah, blah, whatever it is, it's ultimately has to do with taxes, okay? So the underlying power, you now have 3 choices: the power to tax and spend for the general welfare, the power to borrow. And sadly, we're in a position where most of the discretionary budget of the United States is borrowed, okay? So the power to borrow is really important. It's a budgetary power, okay? So your choices in your answer that you should be looking for: budgetary power, which covers both taxing and borrowing, taxing, or in this case, borrowing, which makes C the correct answer. And again, most people are going to miss that question. The AP exam, they won't admit it, but it operates on a bell curve. The way a bell curve works is if you're completely average, you're going to get a 3. If you're 1 standard deviation above the average, you get a 4. 2 standard deviations above, you get a 5. Well, what characterizes the difference between a 2 and a 3 and a 3 and a 4? Questions like this. Okay, so you get these questions right, you're going to be in much better shape than, you know, the person sitting next to you who misses it. Okay. All right. These questions on page 7, I don't know that we really need to go through them. I was just going to give you some strategies, okay? Start with the first column, start with the right column on the left, okay? And obviously read the question. Which of the following is an accurate comparison of Federalist and Anti-Federalist views on government? Okay, Federalist. If you get a hit, if it's accurate, then and only then do you look in the other column. So, favored a weak central government. Is that what Federalists favored? No. Believed the creation of the Bill of Rights was necessary? No. Favored legislative branch having more powers than the executive? Believed a large republic ensured the best protection of individual freedoms? Yes, that's the whole statement, summation of Federalist 10. And Anti-Federalists believed only a small republic could be best ensure protection of individual freedoms. That is the summation of Brutus 1. Okay, so again, you've got the answer key to these. You can look those up on your own, but use that strategy of one column and then the other. There will be probably 4 to 6 questions like that on the exam on Monday. Page 8. Practice question, which of the following is the most accurate interpretation of the political cartoon? You've got the handout for federal benefits, but the stop sign for federal authority. So states love that money. They love that pork barrel spending, but they don't like the accountability that might come with it. So state governments have used the 10th Amendment to override federal. No. State governments are unwilling to share their budget. Nope. State governments prefer federal funding but do not want federal oversight in how the money is spent. There's your answer. All right. Next one, which of the following policies would states most likely prefer according to the political cartoons? Should be an easy one. What's the answer? Block grants. Block grants. All right. How are we doing? I got to speed things up. All right, Unit 2. We'll do Unit 2, and then we'll probably take a break. All right, here we go. Unit 2, the enduring understanding, the Republican ideal in the U.S. is manifested in the structure and operation of the legislative branch. Describe the different structures, powers, functions of each House of Congress. Okay, and so you can read the outline. The Senate is designed to represent states equally. The Houses represent population. Different chambers, let's focus on the second one. Different chamber sizes and constituencies influence the formality of debate. Okay. In the unit summaries for Unit 2, there is a comparison of the House and Senate. The single most important thing to understand is that these differences are by design. The House is designed to accommodate the people. The Senate, as originally designed, was designed to accommodate the states. So it is more prestigious to be a senator than a representative. Representatives have to face the voters every 2 years, every single one of them. Now, as you should know, the states do a lot of things to make it easy, especially large states, for representatives to get reelected because of gerrymandering and stuff like that, okay? Senators have a more protected status because senators, not only do they serve longer terms, but the Senate as an institution has a built-in protection that they will never be uprooted like the House could potentially be because only a third of the seats are up for re-election. So in the very first Senate class that was elected in 1790 or whenever, 1/3 of the Senate had a 2-year term, 1/3 of the Senate had a 4-year term, a third of the Senate had a 6-year term, and then moving forward, when they get re-elected, then it's a 6-year term. So that has the effect of never putting the Senate in the position of being up for grabs because of an angry electorate. Okay, so, and then again, because of the size differences between the House and the Senate, don't forget, the House, if you were to look at a House committee hearing, you'd hear, you know, Representative Smith from California, you have 2 minutes, and then they're, well, I believe, blah, 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 and then at the end, you hear this gavel. Okay, they'd be, better with the mic. The senator's time is, or the representative's time has expired. The gentleman's time has expired. And then they get really angry. The gentleman's time has expired. And then, you know, I yield my time. There's all these procedural things that are happening when they're having debates. In the Senate, I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam. I am. Ted Cruz reading green eggs and ham. I can't really get into the mind of Ted Cruz, but I think he deep down knew that that would forever be remembered. Ted Cruz in 2013 did a filibuster to try to advocate for the defunding of the Affordable Care Act, okay? In the Senate, as you all should know, when you use the privilege of speaking to delay or to try to stop legislation, that is called what? The filibuster, okay. And as we've talked about, an actual standing up and talking filibuster is somewhat of a rarity. Ted Cruz and Rand Paul were the last senators to actually attempt actual talking filibusters, only in the case of Ted Cruz, it wasn't really for the purpose of a filibuster, it was to get attention. And the same is true for Rand Paul. There hasn't been an actual stand-up and talk filibuster since probably, I don't know, the 1950s or something, or before that. That is because in the Senate, it is much easier to institute a hold. Every single member of the Senate has the ability to place a hold on a piece of legislation. If they do that, if they take a piece of legislation, I'm taking this, and you can't have it. It takes 60 votes, a cloture vote. Write that down, C-L-O-T-U-R-E, cloture vote, to overcome it. And that is not easy to do. 60 votes is hard to get in the Senate. And so the Senate, you have these tactics available that aren't available in the House because the House is governed by strict rules. Who are the people that have the equivalent power as a senator to potentially, stop legislation in a similar manner? Committee chairs. Committee chairs have the ability to do that. That's called pigeonholing, and to force a bill out of committee is called a discharge petition. Okay. So just looking at the outline, the enumerated implied powers in Congress allow the creation of public policy by Congress, which includes passing a federal budget, raising revenue, coining money, declaring war, maintaining the armed forces, enacting legislation that addresses a wide range of economic, environmental, social issues. Okay, while I'm on the topic, the budget. Congress, if you look at Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, Congress is required to pass an annual budget. Every single penny of federal spending has to be approved by Congress with the regular lawmaking process. This gives to the Congress something that no other branch of government has: budgetary power. And budgetary power can be a very effective tool in forcing negotiation. The president may want a new policy passed. Look at what's happening with the situation in Ukraine. Biden has gone to Congress now several times and said, yeah, we need to send them more money. And every single time he has to ask Congress, because he doesn't have the power to just, he's commander-in-chief and he can send troops out there, but he can't compel them to provide funding. He has to ask them, and Congress has to comply. Most of the time with foreign policy situations like that, there's a great deal of deference, which means they usually give the president what he wants. And we're certainly seeing that with that situation. All right, next one, explain how the power structure and function of both houses affect the policymaking process, and we kind of already talked about this. By design, different structures, powers, and functions of the U.S. Senate and House affect policymaking. Though both chambers rely on committees to conduct hearings and debate bills, different constitutional responsibilities of the House and the Senate affect policymaking. So just once a quick reminder, both the House and the Senate rely on a committee system. The committee system achieves something that really is necessary, that is specialization and specialized knowledge. Watch out for questions like this. A senator from Iowa who wants to best represent their constituents would most likely seek a committee assignment on which committee? And, I guess if you're not from Iowa, you don't know this, but if you were to randomly parachute out of an airplane in the state of Iowa, you would There's a 99.9% chance you land in a cornfield, okay? That's all there is agriculture. So I don't know, the agriculture committee, that's what you should be on. So what, you know, if you want to be effective for the state of Texas, energy and commerce. We're a big oil producing state, so energy and commerce. So look for something that makes sense with regard to that. Okay. Page 10. Chamber-specific procedures, rules, and roles that impact the policymaking include debate rules. We talked about that. Role of the speaker, filibuster and cloture, holds. Okay, so we've already kind of talked through all that stuff. Just, you know, remember that the reason the House, the committee system is more important in the House than the Senate. Every senator is basically equal in stature, even the freshman senators. In the House, there is a much greater reliance on the seniority system and committee placement as a means of acquiring power and influence. And only the longest-serving members of the House end up on the best committees. So that's a big thing to understand. Okay. Second bullet point, Congress must generate a budget. Okay, so we talked about that. Mandatory spending and entitlement spending and discretionary spending. I want to underline those terms. Mandatory spending includes Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. By the way, we care for the elderly. We aid the poor. So Medicaid is for poor people. Medicare is for old people. And all of those are called entitlements. That is money that has to be spent before we can do anything else. In the unit summaries, take a look at page 53 real quick, and we'll come back to the outline here in a second, but the first pie graph is the mandatory spending pie chart. You can see that in a typical budget, almost 2/3 of it, more than 2/3, almost 3/4 of it, is spent before we even get to choose anything about how to spend the budget. That is Social Security, Medicare, and interest on the national debt. The remaining portion of the budget is what we call discretionary spending. The bottom pie graph is how the discretionary budget is spent, and if you look at that, half of that goes to the military. So think about all the things that the federal government does, all the bureaucratic agencies and all of the jobs that are, you know, funded with federal funds, and, you know, there are, you know, literally millions of federal employees if you count the military. And all of those salaries, all of the functionings, all the office supplies that all those offices have comes out of that ever-shrinking portion of the discretionary budget. So that's an important thing to understand if you haven't thought about it before. Okay. Page 10, back to page 10. Explain how congressional behavior is influenced by election processes, partisanship, and government. And there was where we talk about gerrymandering and a couple of important concepts. Elections that have led to a divided government, including partisan votes against presidential initiatives and congressional refusal to confirm appointments of lame duck appointments. I think that line was added because of Merrick Garland. A lame duck appointment is a president in his final term. So if a president is in his second term, in the last year of his presidency, he's said to be a lame duck. That's not a derogatory term, that's the political term that's applied to that. I don't know where it came from, but anyway. When Obama was president, he tried to appoint someone to the Supreme Court in his last year of office. And you should all know this, the Senate has the ability to confirm or not confirm members of the court and the Supreme Court. And Congress, under Mitch McConnell, the Senate I should say, said, you know what, nah, we're gonna wait. And they took a gamble that a Republican president might be elected in 2016. Lo and behold, that occurred, and that seat was held open for an entire year. So again, it speaks to the power that the Senate has over this process, that they can do stuff like that. Okay. There was something else. Oh, trustee, delegate, and politico. We'll talk about these court cases here in a second. Trustee, delegate, and politico. Those are terms you have to know. If a member of Congress is doing exactly what their constituents want, he is said to be a delegate. So if something is popular and the senators or representative says, okay, I got you, and they vote for it because it's popular, that's the delegate model. If the senator or representative votes with their own gut instinct, okay, you know, maybe sending a bunch of military aid to Ukraine is not popular in your particular district. But you think, well, you know what, we don't want the Russians to take over their neighboring countries, so I'm going to vote for it anyway. That would be the trustee model. Okay, you go against your constituents because of some reason. Politico is trying to have it both ways. Okay, the court cases related to gerrymandering. Okay, first of all, you have to know these cases, obviously. Baker versus Carr. Baker versus Carr dealt with a situation in Tennessee. Okay, if you get this question on the AP exam in an FRQ, mention the state of Tennessee. If you can't remember that, well, I guess generically referred to as state. But state of Tennessee hadn't done redistricting for 60 years. How lazy is that? They didn't draw their state legislative districts. So as cities grew, the cities became more densely populated, but they had the same number of representatives. So they were underrepresented. And that led to a situation which was not consistent with principles of equal representation. So they filed suit. Now, the court didn't just automatically decide to decide this case. They first of all had to decide if they had the power, because this is a matter typically left to state legislatures. But here we had a situation where the Equal Protection Clause became an issue, and that's the reason the court agreed to hear the case. So Baker versus Carr, threshold question, can we hear the case? Answer, yes, because this is a matter of equality under the law. Second question is, okay, what are we going to decide? Answer, one person, one vote, Baker versus Carr. Shaw versus Reno was the North Carolina case. Now, this is a little bit complicated, so we'll try to make it simple, okay? In the state of North Carolina, they have a sizable African-American population that was underrepresented in their congressional delegation. In other words, for years, North Carolina had an all-white slate of congresspeople, even though, I don't know the exact number, but let's say 20% of the population was black. So the Voting Rights Act actually has provisions that are supposed to remedy that, and they're supposed to draw congressional districts to maximize the possibility that a person of color would get elected to Congress. And so the other component is North Carolina was under the pre-clearance requirements of the Voting Rights Act. So North Carolina submitted a proposal that resulted in one African American getting elected to Congress. And the federal government rejected it, saying, now you really should have two. There's 11 total representatives at the time, you should have at least two. So they redid it, and you may remember this case. There's this goofy-looking district in the middle of North Carolina that was so narrowly drawn based on race that it was literally house to house, encircling African-American households to create this really ridiculous-looking congressional district. And they said, there, are you happy now? And the federal government said, good enough. And a bunch of people in North Carolina, white people, said, oh, wait a minute, wait. This is like ridiculous gerrymandering. And the Supreme Court took up the case and they said, okay, yeah, this is blatant racial gerrymandering, okay? Racial gerrymandering of that kind is impermissible, says the court. Okay, so the North Carolina case, Shaw versus Reno, racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional, even if you're trying to comply with the Voting Rights Act. So just remember that case. Now, the reason it was unconstitutional is it was simply too egregious. It was too, obviously drawn based on race. They could have drawn it to accommodate more people. And the reasoning in that case, if you remember that case, was basically that, look, if we allow this kind of blatant racial gerrymandering, you're going to have representatives that believe that they only represent black people, which is not consistent with American values and stuff like that. It has echoes of segregation and all this stuff. So that's kind of, if you read that opinion, they talked about that. So some practice questions, page 10. Which of the following scenarios best illustrates a member supporting pork barrel legislation? Probably need to talk about, oh yeah, we can talk about that too. Let's go over it real quick and then we'll look at the question. Pork barreling versus log rolling. Okay, every part of the country likes federal money because it's like free money. At least it seems like it. So the example that I use is the Katy Freeway project. And And if you didn't have my class, I show this video of a ribbon cutting ceremony literally on the overpass in the connector ramp between I-10 and Highway 99 that was built in 2010 with stimulus money. The stimulus bill in 2009 included an earmark for that specific piece of infrastructure. And members of Congress, literally at this ribbon cutting ceremony, are taking credit for it. It's the most obvious form of credit claiming ever. That's pork barrel legislation, okay? Pork barrel legislation is something that every member of Congress does. The most egregious example of that we talked about in class was oh God, what was the guy's name? This guy lived in Pennsylvania and had an airport built in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which is a little town about 45 miles from Pittsburgh, which has a major airport. So they built this federally funded airport because this member of Congress didn't want to drive, the hour and a half that it took to get to the airport because it's mountainous, and to this day, we have this airport that has a whopping 2 flights per week, typically, and it's still paid for with millions of dollars of federal funding every year. Absolutely ridiculous. But that is the kind of thing that can happen with pork barrel spending. Now, log rolling. Make a note of this, because I don't think we talked about this a lot in class. Log rolling is when members of Congress help each other by agreeing to support each other's earmarks or pork barrel spending provisions. And I don't know if you've ever witnessed the sport of log rolling, but it's a 2-person sport where they're literally on top of a log, and the game only works when they're both actively participating, okay? So I don't know if that's the origin of the term or not, but log rolling is something that most members of Congress engage in. It's kind of like, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of situation where they need each other's support, so they agree to not complain about each other's wasteful spending for the purpose of helping get stuff done. Okay, so which of the following, page 10, which of the following best illustrates a member of Congress supporting pork barrel legislation? The answer is C, a senator from an agricultural state amending legislation to establish a potato research institute in his or her state. Okay, so lots of pork barreling. I know certainly the town where I grew up, Iowa State University, Ames, Iowa, we had lots and lots of federal earmarks that funded all sorts of buildings and stuff like that. And by the way, that would be a project grant. Going back to some federalism stuff, that would be an example of a categorical grant. Which of the following scenarios is an example of the trustee model of representation? Okay, let's go through the choices. The NAACP leadership sends a representative to Washington to lobby for changes to the Voting Rights Act. It's weird. Congress passes a bill allocating money to clean up nuclear waste sites after a large scale of peaceful protests. A member of Congress votes to close a popular tax loophole based on the belief that the money would be better spent paying down the debt. He's going against his constituents because of something he believes in. Trustee model, C is the answer. Okay, the presidency has been enhanced beyond its express constitutional powers. All right, a couple of things about the presidency. In a normal situation, when you have, think of a Reagan-esque time period, the list of powers of the president is not very big. There's just not much. He has the power to issue pardons. He has the power as commander-in-chief. That's a pretty big one. He has the appointment power, but you don't get an exhaustive list of presidential powers like you do congressional powers. And so what that means then, logically, is that the presidents have power based on what has happened in the past. And that is why the ability to persuade is one of the single most important powers of the president. So we call that the bully pulpit, being able to channel the inherent fame that comes with the office to drive a policy agenda. Okay, so bargaining, persuasion of all those powers, again, it's not an official power, but that's one of the ones that's most important. Okay, a couple other random things with regard to the presidency. Sometimes presidents issue executive orders. Presidential use of executive orders can be very effective or can be a sign of weakness, okay? So if a president is issuing an executive order because they can't get along with Congress, and I don't know if you remember during class, but I showed a clip of Obama back when he was frustrated because he couldn't get anything through Congress because of divided government. And he gave his old, I've got a pen, I've got a phone. And he basically was saying, I can sign executive orders. And you just admitted that you're not working with Congress. You're not, come on, man, at least try. And he would joke about it, They say I should meet with Mitch McConnell. You go have a drink with Mitch McConnell. He would openly mock the idea of getting along with Congress. That's kind of an admission of weakness. And, not that Obama wasn't a good president or anything like that, but, Bill Clinton, he just, I was working with members of Congress the other day, and we had a good meeting and a bipartisan support. He was all about just working with the other. You guys obviously weren't alive when Bill Clinton was president, but he was quite the schmoozer. So executive orders born out of frustration, like DACA, where you try to do something big without Congress, weakness. But when executive orders channel existing power within the bureaucratic structure, and I've used this before, I want you to think about this, because the bureaucracy has within it, the more bureaucratic agencies there are, the more opportunities there are for policy meddling from the president. Because don't forget, bureaucratic agencies already have discretionary authority. Now, I probably shouldn't use these examples because they both got struck down in the courts, but Biden he really, really wanted this vaccine mandate. He really wanted the mask mandate. So how do you do that? Well, you direct OSHA as president, hey, really would like to have a rule on this. And so they use their authority. You know what, I'm going to use the example in your packet is I think a better one, because Obama actually did this quite successfully with environmental policy. Obama really wanted climate change legislation. Congress is like, nah, we're not doing it. They just didn't have the support in Congress. So let's see, can you think of an agency that was designed to handle environmental protection? Like the Environmental Protection Agency, perhaps. And aren't they supposed to prevent pollution and stuff like that? So Obama was like, we're going to stop coal emissions, and we're going to limit the emissions coming from these coal-fired. And so what did they do? They fired off a memo to the EPA, and they say, you know what? We need CO2 emissions to be reduced. So EPA is like, I got you. They do a study. The study says, hey, CO2 emissions are bad, so we got to limit them. They make a rule. So the president uses an executive order to kind of nudge the EPA to do something that he wants done legislatively, but they can't, so they just use the existing power already vested in the EPA. Bingo, you got a policy. Okay, so that's when executive orders are effective. When executive orders are kind of like a hissy fit because you can't get something done because you won't work with Congress, that's when you look weak. And that's why Obama was probably rightfully mocked on SNL for issuing this DACA executive order, because it was something really, really big that you're trying to do just, with it. I mean, it's that's something that is screaming congressional involvement. And by the way, for the record, control over immigration is an enumerated power of Congress. So the president can't just, go rogue and try to do something with immigration by himself. At least not supposed to. Okay, other stuff. I'm trying to think if I leave anything out here. Gridlock. I don't want to take the time to really go over it right now, but in your packet, I believe it's page 49 and 50, you can take a quick peek at that. There is some information on the difference between divided government, divided party control, and unified government. And I'll just go over it real quickly with you guys. Gridlock is very common, okay? It always happens. When gridlock is most troubling is when you have this hyperpolarization. And so let's go over the various scenarios that can lead to gridlock, all right? When you have unified government, but divided government, unified party control, the House and the Senate are the opposite party of the president. That was Obama's situation in 2014, okay? That's divided government, unified party control in the House and Senate. The president's going to get out his veto pen, okay? When you have just plain old divided government, where the House and the Senate are, by the way, that's called divided party control, when the House and Senate are opposite each other, the president doesn't have to veto anything because the House and the Senate are doing completely different things. If you think of the lawmaking process, okay, right now, the Democrats have a big voting rights bill. It's dead in the water because the Senate isn't taking it up. They don't have the votes, okay? Now, if the House and the Senate were truly unified, and they're supposed to be right now, but we got some defectors on the Democrat side that don't want to go along. If they were truly unified, the Senate would be working on a voting rights bill too, but they're not. So when you have that divided party control, stuff doesn't get done, okay? Now, when you have unified government, make a note of this, unified government is most common after a popular, newly elected president. Obama had unified party control, unified government for his first 2 years in office. That's called the honeymoon period. Okay, and when you have that situation, you can, I mean, it's full throttle with your agenda. You can get all kinds of stuff done. And that's why the Affordable Care Act was, and by the way, one of the many reasons the Clintons hate the Obamas, at least down deep, if you really look at the way they've behaved. Hillary Clinton, and I know this is like ancient history to you guys, but Hillary Clinton was supposed to do, that was her little baby, was healthcare reform. 1993, she's in charge of healthcare reform. She can't get it done. Not only does Obama run against her in 2008, but Obama's signature issue is healthcare reform, and he got it done when she couldn't. And you know, that's just, you know, kind of another poke in the eye between those two, you know, families in America. But anyway, okay, let's look at some practice questions. Page 11, top of the page. The president is most likely to use the executive order to make important policy when? Congress is dominated by the president's party. A compromise cannot be reached with Congress. The Supreme Court is divided along ideological lines and negotiation. Okay, so B is going to be your answer. Which of the following is an example of how separation of powers creates friction between the executive and legislative branches in the policy-making process? President threatens to issue an executive order for stricter gun control if Congress continues to refuse to take action. And lastly, in Federalist 70, and by the way, Federalist 70 argued for a singular executive with robust powers so the president can make decisive decisions. In Federalist 70, Alexander Hamilton states that energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. This statement, Hamilton is arguing in favor of the need for A is your answer, a single executive who can respond quickly to crises. Okay, real quickly, bottom of page 11. I have to speed things up here. Just remember the White House staff and is one of the groups of people that does not require Senate approval. So the president has this very strong appointment power, but the White House staff are his close advisors. So positions within the White House staff, chief of staff, the office of First Lady or First Gentleman someday, the senior advisors, White House counsel, press secretary, those are all members of the White House staff. Okay. Vetoes, signing statements in the lawmaking process generally, okay. You know, just be aware the veto power when used is really almost like a policy failure. The veto power is all about threatening to use it to shape policy. So make sure that you understand that. Vetoes are kind of a last resort. Other options the president has when presented with legislation, doing nothing, and if the president does nothing and it's early in the term, what happens to that bill? Turns into law in 10 days, okay? If it's at the end of the term and there's fewer than 10 days left, the president doesn't sign a bill, pocket veto, which, by the way, is technically not a veto. It's running out the clock. You make it so that the Congress could not even, if they wanted to, they couldn't override it. A regular veto can be overridden with a 2/3 vote, by the way. Okay. Now, an option that is becoming more and more commonly tested on the AP exam is signing the bill, but issuing a signing statement to basically indicate disapproval with the legislation. And we see that more and more. All right. Explain how communication technology has changed the president's relationship with the national constituency. Obviously, we have modern technology, social media. Apparently, Trump has just launched Truth Social now, so, and now that he can, I guess he's, feelings are hurt with the whole Twitter situation. Even with Elon Musk buying it, he says he's going to, stick with his Truth Social now. But, during the Trump presidency, obviously, Twitter was a major means of communication to everyone's, most people's dismay that didn't like Trump, at least. But that's a big change in the past. Okay. The design of the judicial branch. Talk about the judicial branch real quickly. First of all, the judiciary was established in Article 3. Okay, Federalist 78 argues for an independent judiciary. You need to know the 3 independence provisions: appointed, not elected, life tenure, salaries can't be reduced. Okay, the Supreme Court has this awesome power of judicial review that came from Marbury versus Madison, which interpreted basically a provision of the Judiciary Act, which is supposed to give the Supreme Court this power over these certain types of cases, was unconstitutional because it modified the jurisdiction of the court. The one difficulty that the judiciary has, especially the Supreme Court, is they lack enforcement power. And so you've heard me talk about it in class, most of you, many, many times, but the issue of legitimacy has to be within your understanding of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has to, they have to be very careful about the cases that they choose. And the reason they have to be careful about the cases they choose is they lack enforcement power. So if they choose to hear a case that decides something that's out of whack with public opinion, then they risk being ignored. And they don't like that. So when they decide cases like Roe versus Wade or the Obergefell case, which was the gay marriage case that we talked about a lot, those cases have to be in line with the times. We talk about Plessy versus Ferguson. How could they possibly have ruled ever that separating people by race was okay? Well, because at the time, that was societal norms. And if they had ruled outside of societal norms, people would have been, what do they know? And they would have been ignored. So it's one of the great ironies that you really have to understand about the courts is that they cannot enforce their own rulings. They depend on the other branches, so they're really careful about the cases they're choosing and the timing. Okay, page 12. During his confirmation hearing, Chief Justice John Roberts stated in Roe v. Wade, it is, quote, settled law of the land. The statement suggests that in a case that challenges the constitutionality of legislation restricting privacy and reproductive rights, which of the following should be a key factor in the court's ruling? Well, D is your answer, reliance on legal precedent. There's a term for that. What's it called? Stare decisis. Write that down. Stare decisis. Supreme Court has issued a ruling that was unpopular with the majority of Americans. The President and Congress might be able to lessen the impact of the decision by reducing the pay of judges, overruling the Supreme Court's decisions by a 2/3 vote in Congress. How absurd is that? That's not true. Impeaching the justices in the majority. No. Refusing to actively enforce the decision is correct. All right. The exercise of judicial review can lead to debate about the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. Okay, we've already talked about that. The majority party, this is page 13, top of the page, question. Majority party in the Senate is concerned that the Supreme Court has made a number of ideologically dangerous and controversial rulings. Which of the following actions would the Senate take to attempt to limit the Supreme Court's power? And this is this is probably a tougher one. Replace the Chief Justice with someone with whom they agree? No, life tenure, can't do that. Pass legislation that would limit the impact of the court's rulings. I think we got a winner. C, ratify a constitutional amendment limiting the Supreme Court's power. No. Enforce term limits for no. There aren't term limits. So B is correct. Okay. Restrictions on the Supreme Court are represented by congressional legislation to modify constitutional amendments, judicial appointments, confirmations, ignoring Supreme Court decisions, or legislation impacting court decisions. So this is a pretty commonly tested area, by the way. They often test about checks against the court. Okay, so really there aren't too many. The legislature can refuse to appoint people on ideological grounds in the future. Congress, if they wanted to, could create more justices on the court. They could make it an 11-person court. Or if somebody resigns moving forward, they could shrink the size of the court. They can affect the operating budget of the court, as ridiculous as that sounds. But they can't reduce their salaries. So there's really a limited amount of things that Congress can do. The president can appoint different people. Or as President Trump did, appoint like-minded people in the lower courts. Try to influence the kind of cases that make it to the Supreme Court. Okay, but not a whole lot that can be done. All right, page 14, the bureaucracy. The federal bureaucracy is a powerful institution implementing federal policies with sometimes questionable accountability. By the way, that is an old, outdated accounting of that. They, the enduring understanding, I think, has changed to the federal bureaucracy is a powerful institution that implements federal policies. They took out the, I don't know why, but, okay. So the most important thing about the bureaucracy to understand is that when Congress creates a policy, they do not have the expertise to get into all the details of a policy. So at some point, Congress created the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I don't know this for a fact, but I'm guessing most members of Congress don't have degrees in nuclear physics, okay? But the people that work at the Nuclear Regulatory Agency hopefully do. And they have a good sense of, what the issues are. Someone who works for the Consumer Product Safety Commission probably has expertise in that field. So here's the thing about bureaucratic agencies. They are created specifically to carry out laws, and they're given power by the Congress to implement those laws. And when a bureaucratic agency makes a rule, they do so with the full force of law, and they have the discretion to do it. So back when I was talking about, executive orders directing agencies to do this or that, they already have this inherent authority, particularly the regulatory agencies like the Securities and Exchange Commission or the FAA or, some of these regulatory agencies. Okay, now, regulatory agencies oftentimes form relationships with the very industries they regulate, and this is when we get into this idea of the iron triangle, okay? When Congress creates an agency, they give it funding for a specific purpose, okay? The easiest examples are, talking about military. Congress has an interest in, the latest and greatest stealth aircraft, okay? So the Pentagon has within it a sub-agency that deals with new technology, and they get on the line with Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, all these defense contractors, and they say, hey, word is there's going to be a funding for a new aircraft. What you got? And so they'll put forth a proposal and work up a, prototype, and then Congress will choose. Well, industry has a vested interest in making the Pentagon happy. They're going to get lucrative contracts. The Pentagon needs private industry to make the things. Congress is, concerned about national defense, so they're going to provide the money. Everybody's happy. So we see iron triangles form in all sorts of policy areas. The danger with iron triangles is nobody knows about them. Nobody, these are policy decisions that are being made out of sight, out of mind most of the time. And occasionally something goes wrong, and that's why we talk about the 737 MAX. And this was simply Boeing, which had just an outstanding safety record throughout their company's history. The manufacturer of most of the non-combat aircraft in the United States Air Force, and the FAA was just a little bit too trusting. And the result is a Boeing 737 MAX, which was really a redesigned aircraft. They were marketing it as, just an upgrade, and they didn't want to have pilots to go through flight training and stuff like that. And so they certified this aircraft, and it was totally unsafe, as it turned out. And what do you do when an agency screws up? Well, you have hearings, oversight. There are two types of oversight that Congress has with regard to bureaucratic agencies. Budgetary oversight, where they can trim the agency's budget. really, that's an academic argument to make. In reality, as we talked about, agency budgets typically follow, whatever they did last year plus some for inflation, so trying to cut budgets is really difficult. Cutting budgets means cutting jobs. Nobody likes to do that. So the most common type of oversight is investigative oversight. Well, they'll call members of the management team at Boeing before Congress, put them under oath, make them testify, and Congress can compel truthful testimony. If you lie under oath in Congress, that's, you can be prosecuted. So, okay. Just a couple other things. We talked about oversight. Explain how the president ensures executive branch agencies carry out their responsibilities. Probably worth pointing out, the president appoints every single person that heads up all these departments and agencies that have a governing board, like the FCC, they will always be tilted in favor of the president in power. Okay? So that is why, when Obama was president, he got net neutrality rules. When Trump was president, they reversed them because you have that one extra vote. Okay? All right. How do you hold the bureaucratic agencies accountable? Well, basic checks and balances. Okay, let's go back to the vaccine mandate. And I don't know what your opinion is on this. You probably can figure out my opinion. I'm not a big mandate kind of person with stuff like this, but conditioning employment on getting a vaccine, and some people think, well, what's the big deal? And other people are like, well, hey, this is record time, this, maybe what if it's unsafe, whatever reason. But some people simply didn't want to take it and they lost their jobs. Well, the authority to issue that mandate, Biden was claiming through OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. When the court looked at this, they're looking like, okay, this is a pretty big rule from this agency, and they go, what was this agency created for? OSHA. Occupational Safety and Health, hard hats, eye wash stations, goggles, proper labeling of chemicals. It was not designed to force everybody in America to get a vaccine. And so the court struck it down. That is a real-life, recent example of how the courts, in this case, can hold bureaucratic agencies and review their practices through the lens of the Constitution. Okay, practice questions real quick. Which of the following is most likely to occur as a result of new legislation regarding automotive safety? Correct answer is going to be C. The Department of Transportation will be given discretionary authority to create auto regulations. A new president has been elected and has a number of positions to fill within the federal bureaucracy. Which of the following is an example of filling a position based on patronage? Okay, that's another thing I forgot to mention. Bureaucratic agencies are populated with people who are thought to be experts in their field. You cannot work in a bureaucratic agency unless you pass a civil service exam in the field that you're in. That is from the Pendleton Act, okay? And that is also known as the merit principle. Patronage is when people get their jobs based on political favoritism. So, choosing a Secretary of State to appease members from the opposition party, that's not patronage. Nominating a high-level campaign fundraiser to serve as an ambassador to New Zealand. Let's think about that, a high-level campaign fundraiser. Ambassador to New Zealand, that sounds fun. You get to travel to New Zealand. It's a nice country. They have a strange accent and lots of mountains and stuff, and it's an island. So that's pretty cool. That is patronage, okay? Rewarding somebody with a cush government job, you get to fly over there, drive with fancy diplomat plates, and get all the perks of being an ambassador. I don't know what the ambassador to New Zealand does. I don't know. What do you think? I have a feeling they get taken out to dinner a lot. I don't know. Which of the following scenarios best illustrates a formal check on the power of the bureaucracy? A lobbyist representing the National Rifle Association refusing to meet with him? No. A Secretary of Defense being called to testify before a congressional committee. And there's your winner. Okay. When Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, our consulate in Benghazi, Libya, came under attack. There were allegations that they could have scrambled jets and done something to prevent it. This was like a 20-hour siege. And at the time they said, well, they were upset about some YouTube video, so people just showed up with rocket-propelled grenades and attacked the embassy, which was obviously not true. You guys probably don't remember this when it happened. Hillary Clinton was called before Congress to testify about why nothing was done to help these 4 people that got killed. She was there for 11 hours straight and being grilled about this because she was the Secretary of State. The State Department is a bureaucratic agency, so that is an example of oversight and how these hearings can hold public officials accountable. Okay, when we come back, we will start Unit 3 and finish out everything else. So let's take about a 10-minute break. All right, well, during the break, I had a question about the cabinet. It occurred to me that I kind of didn't go over that. So real quick, the cabinet is the president's choices to run all of the bureaucratic departments. So the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, these are all people chosen, interestingly, not based on merit as much as they are based on political considerations. One of the great ironies in the bureaucracy is we have all these agencies populated by people who are supposed to be experts in their field, and yet the people running them are political appointees, okay? So, and yes, they have to be confirmed by the Senate. And collectively, we talk about all of those appointments that the president makes as his administration or her administration. So presidential administration is all of those positions that are chosen. And here's the thing. When you have bureaucratic agencies headed by people chosen by the president with a similar mindset, they're going to have basically all throughout the government, at least if the president is good at making his choices, a consistency with regard to the ideological issues that the agencies ultimately deal with. So that's something important to think about as well. Okay, Unit 3, Civil Liberties and Civil Rights. Now, most of the cases that you're required to know are from this unit. So, you know, I'm probably not going to go over every single case, but let's look at the enduring understanding. Provisions of the Constitution's Bill of Rights are continually being interpreted to balance the power of government and the civil liberties of individuals. Okay, so a couple things about the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, as originally written, was designed to place limitations on national power. And so there have been well, there's one court case in particular that we talked about in my class, Barron versus Baltimore, where somebody sued a state for taking their property. It was a harbor that the depth was rendered unusable because they were dredging a ship channel, and it resulted in the water depth being to where they couldn't get the ships in to use the harbor. Anyway, so they sued based on the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. The Supreme Court, pre-Civil War, said that the Fifth Amendment did not apply to the states. So this goes back to another concept, really, with federalism. You remember layer cake federalism versus, or in other words, dual federalism versus cooperative federalism? Okay, the early version of federalism was there were 2 separate entities. The federal government was distinct from the states. And obviously now that's very different. But the 14th Amendment changed that. And one of the big themes in Unit 3 is selective incorporation, the process by which rights were gradually, where the states had to adhere to them. Okay, so civil liberties versus civil rights. Civil liberties are guaranteed by placing limitations on government power. Civil rights are created by government action. So the Civil Rights Act and any civil rights law operates by identifying classes of individuals that have potentially been oppressed in the past or denied rights and positively affording them rights by the law. Civil liberties are more consistent with the concept of natural rights, where people are thought to have these rights already, and government has to be restricted in order to protect those rights. So the language of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That's a limitation on congressional power. Okay, so civil liberties, obviously a big part of Unit 3. The Bill of Rights again, just remember that it was not originally thought to apply necessarily to the states. That process took years and years and years, over a century really, before most of the Bill of Rights was applied to the states. Okay, so next one is explain the extent to which the Supreme Court's interpretation of the First and Second Amendments reflects a commitment to individual liberty. So it is critically important that you know the basic components of the First Amendment, okay? You have a right of free speech, you have freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. Within the freedom of religion, we have two clauses that you need to differentiate between. The Establishment Clause, which is basically anytime there's an instance where it appears that government may be endorsing religion, and you most commonly run into those issues in public schools because, or you know, possibly a university or a courthouse or something like that, because that's where people interact with government. So a law that tried to you know, force recitation of a prayer, which is the Engel case, violates this idea of the Establishment Clause. And as a result, that school prayer policy was struck down. The Free Exercise Clause involves any time there's a personal religious interest that contradicts a government policy. We've seen that play out in the Hobby Lobby case, which is not a required case, but Hobby Lobby, you know, kind of like Chick-fil-A, closed on Sundays, a Christian-affiliated business. They were strenuously objecting to the provision in the Affordable Care Act, which would have required this coverage of, you know, what they innocuously refer to as women's health services. It's a cover for abortion services. And if you're a Christian organization that's opposed to an abortion, having to be forced to pay for a policy that pays for abortion goes against their religious beliefs. They won their case. So the court has, you know, that's a free exercise issue. The Hobby Lobby's interest in freely practicing their religion outweighed the state's interest in requiring this health care coverage. And by the way, in that case, you know, if a woman wants to get an abortion, there's a lot of other avenues. It's part of the court's reasoning, I would guess. Okay, let's look at some of the sample questions. Page 16, a state government places security cameras facing a popular site of protest in a public square in front of its state house. This scenario illustrates the balance of promoting stability and ensuring civil liberties. So that's going to be your answer for that one. Public school district implemented a policy that allowed students to vote on whether they want a student-led prayer to be read at football games. This policy was later found to be unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court, which of the following clauses did the policy most likely violate? Be careful on this one, because some of you might be tempted to put the free exercise clause, but if it's a public event at a publicly funded place like a school stadium, that's going to be an Establishment Clause issue. All right, Engel and Yoder, just remember the Engel is a New York State school daily recitation of prayer, said to be unconstitutional. Wisconsin versus Yoder, Amish kids don't have to go to school past the 8th grade because the religious interest of the Amish people outweighs the state's interest in compulsory education. So make sure you remember that case. All right. Then there was this free speech cases, and Tinker versus Des Moines was the armband case. And again, just, I don't know if this helps you. We kind of did one of the review sessions, we kind of did a word association. So if you think of one word when you hear these cases, you know, Tinker versus Des Moines, armband. Okay. The armbands were allowed. Students could wear them because they weren't disruptive, okay? Now, the most likely case, if I were writing the AP exam at least, that is a similar issue that the Supreme Court took up with a different outcome was the Morse versus Frederick, which is the bong hits for Jesus case. And for all of you non-drug users, a bong is a marijuana smoking device, a water-cooled pipe. And taking bong hits for Jesus, is that a religious freedom issue? I don't know. What is it? But either way, the court said it's advocating drug use, and therefore, you know, sorry kids, you're still suspended. Okay, they were not. They didn't win that case. It's different from the armband case because in the armband case they were legitimately protesting, and the bong hits for Jesus case, you know, kind of like advocating drug use, you know, and drugs are bad, so shouldn't do drugs. Okay. Uh, Tinker versus, okay, so Schenck versus United States. This is on my list as one of the most likely FRQ questions. Schenck versus United States is the case that looked at the First Amendment. You got this guy mailing out leaflets, so that would be my word association with Schenck versus United States. He's mailing out leaflets to people, encouraging them really to, do something that's totally American, write your congressperson. But he was encouraging them to write their congressperson to encourage them to overturn the draft law in preparation for World War I. He was arrested for that because that was expressly outlawed in the Sedition Act. And as a result, he was convicted. And the court looked at this and they're like, okay, free speech. Is the right to free speech really absolute? Because I'm sure you can think of a lot of instances where, free speech might rightfully be restricted, like threatening to kill somebody, That's called fighting words, by the way, and that is prohibited speech. So Schenck gave us the idea that there are categories of unprotected speech. Unprotected speech. And for the record, those categories are fighting words, in other words, threats of violence, where there's a likelihood of imminent harm, obscenity, libel and slander. So things like that, and defamation, things like that can be rightfully restricted. And by the way, also commonly tested is that this stands as an example of the Federalists who were hesitant to have a Bill of Rights. They didn't, if you believe in natural rights, the Federalist point of view was, why do we need a Bill of Rights? We have these rights. If we start listing them, then we're just going to open them up to interpretation and potentially impacting that. And all you have to do to understand that argument is there more or less freedom of speech allowed after this ruling? Less. So the Federalists were vindicated in that regard by that decision. So the Schenck case, once again, there are categories of unprotected speech. All right, Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment protects people against cruel and unusual punishment. And the Eighth Amendment has been interpreted to allow the death penalty, but in recent court decisions has carved out some exceptions. So people that are under the age of 18 when they commit a crime that it's a capital offense cannot be put to death. Someone who is mentally incompetent cannot be put to death. This is why, people accused of murder oftentimes claim an insanity defense, because if you can claim that you weren't in the right state of mind at the time of the crime, then you cannot be executed. So that's something the court has ruled on with regard to that. Okay, Second and Fourth Amendments, concerns about public safety, whether or not the government regulation of firearms, a collection of digital metadata promotes or interferes with public safety and individual rights. So it's kind of a weird one. Again, always balancing individual liberties with fundamental rights. So we got the practice questions on page 17. Which of the following actions by public school students would most likely be protected symbolic speech based on the precedent set in Tinker versus Des Moines? And leading prayer on the school public address system? What do you think? No. Publishing an editorial in the school newspaper, and again, they certainly could do that, but based on the precedent in Tinker versus Des Moines, protesting the school board decision by disrupting a school assembly. What was the rationale for Tinker? They could wear the armbands because they weren't disruptive. They were not disruptive. Wearing T-shirts objecting to a school board decision. That's the most consistent with the ruling, so D is correct. Supporters of Hamilton's view that a Bill of Rights could be dangerous to liberty would point to which of the following cases? And there's your answer with the Schenck case. Why? Because liberty was curtailed in the Schenck case. You have less free speech. The application of the death penalty has been limited in recent decades and cannot be applied to minors and people who are found to be mentally ill, which is the reason for this. And again, look for the Eighth Amendment. The Supreme Court changes interpretation of what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment B. All right. Enduring understanding, protections of the Bill of Rights have been selectively incorporated by way of the 14th Amendment's due process rights to prevent state infringement of basic liberties. McDonald versus Chicago is our selective incorporation case. Okay, let's get you your definition one more time. Selective incorporation is the gradual application of principles of law, namely the Bill of Rights, to the states, case-by-case basis, over time. The reason McDonald versus Chicago is the selective incorporation case is because it's 2010. Most of these cases were decided, 50 years ago. But here we have a case in 2010, which prior to 2010, you did not have a right to keep and bear arms that was uniform across the country. There was an incident in New York that I believe might have prompted this. There was a guy who was a former Navy guy who was kind of a gun-toting, type, and he had a concealed carry permit, and the guy must not have been all that bright because, he went to New York, and New York is one of the most, gun-restrictive places anywhere in the country. So he's got a concealed weapon. He goes to visit the Empire State Building, and he goes to the guard, and he's like, hey, I just want to let you know I got a concealed weapon. I want to check it so that you guys know. And dude, come on. So he gets arrested, okay? Because you follow the law of the state that you're in, okay? At the time, possessing a firearm like that in the state of New York was a serious felony. You're not allowed to have a concealed weapon like that. Okay, well now, I don't know what the concealed carry laws are in New York, but now every state in the union has to recognize gun rights and has to accommodate concealed carry because gun ownership, according to McDonald versus Chicago, is now a fundamental right. Let's review something important. When the court declares something to be a fundamental right, in this case it's a right already articulated in the Second Amendment. But even if it's not, even if it's an implied right, like the right to an abortion, an implied right that's recognized as a fundamental right, the Supreme Court has figured out a way to force the states to adhere to these rights. And they used the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. So I want you to write this down somewhere in your notes, all right? The Due Process Clause has been used by the courts to force states to recognize fundamental rights in a process that is known as substantive due process, substantive due process. And while that phrase is not in the College Board outline, it would be a good little, name drop situation to show that you know what you're talking about, if you can explain it. So anytime a fundamental right is recognized by the court, it is the Due Process Clause that the court uses to apply those to the states. And what they have done is basically taken the Due Process Clause and turn it into essentially a judicially imposed supremacy clause. So the Supremacy Clause is designed to where legislation passed by Congress is superior to state law. But these judicial opinions, it might seem rather odd given the fact that the court cannot enforce its own rulings, and yet when the court ruled that abortion was a fundamental right based on a woman's right to privacy, fundamental right to privacy, every state in the union had to rewrite their laws, and they did so. So once again, speaking to the legitimacy of the court really, even though they don't have enforcement power, most of the time people adhere to their cases, or their rulings. The Miranda rule, by the way, the facts of the McDonald versus Chicago case, just real quick, Chicago had a law similar to a law in Washington, D.C., which was the case that preceded that case, the Heller case. The only way to legally possess a firearm was to have it in a state of essentially where it couldn't be used for its intended purpose. Imagine a pile of gun parts. That was the way to legally I'm exaggerating, but the magazine had to be out, it couldn't be loaded, it had to have a trigger lock, it had to be in a gun safe, So imagine the burglar at your door breaking in and, hold on a minute, because your gun is in a state of disassembly. The only way to use it, the only way to legally possess it was to have it in a state where it couldn't be used. And I think that was a big part of the court's reasoning in saying, you know what, this is too far. And then they looked at the history of the Second Amendment. And just real quick, I don't know that they're going to get into this on the exam, but the Second Amendment has the prefatory clause and the operative clause. The prefatory clause says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That prefatory clause implies that the reason to have the right to bear arms is the possibility that we might one day need to raise a militia. This is a time before we had a standing army. Well, that no longer applies, And so that was kind of an issue. And McDonald versus Chicago basically said, look, it is the operative clause. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's consistent with the history of our country. You know, for better or worse, Americans, you know, we love our guns, apparently. That's very, I think there's literally more guns than there are people in our country. So anyway, okay, and then Miranda. Miranda's not a required case, but the rule is, I don't know why they don't just make it a required case, but the Miranda case involved a situation where somebody was subject to a police interrogation without a lawyer present, and the person apparently was unaware of their Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and spilled the beans, and that confession was later ruled to be unconstitutional because the person was not informed of their rights. So the Miranda rule, I'm sure you're all familiar with. You know, if you've ever been arrested, I'm sure most of you have. I'm just kidding. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you can say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one will be provided for. You know, so that's the standard standard admonition in a time of arrest, and that right, as well as the right against unreasonable search and seizure, the right to a jury of your peers. Those collectively are called due process rights. So here's a definition of due process. Due process are all of the steps that have to take place to ensure fairness in our system of justice. And you do need to know your Fifth Amendment rights, your Fourth Amendment rights, Sixth Amendment rights. So let's real quickly. Fourth Amendment is a right against unreasonable search and seizure. Has to be unreasonable, okay? If the police witness something with their own eyes, if they witness somebody shooting somebody and then putting the gun in their pocket and then casually walking away and the police saw it, it is not unreasonable to stop them and search them right there on the spot. The murderer cannot just say, dude, I know my rights. Where's your warrant? You don't got one? That's what I thought. I'll see you later. No, that's not how it works, because that search is not unreasonable, okay? Unreasonable is whether they come breaking down your door at 3 in the morning, rummaging through all of your stuff, because of all places, your home, your domicile is the place where you have the greatest expectation of privacy. So the Fourth Amendment is predicated on a reasonable expectation of privacy. The Fifth Amendment rights, okay, let's go through them. You have the right against self-incrimination. You have a right against double jeopardy. You cannot be tried twice for the same offense. If you're a murderer and you're like O.J. Simpson, allegedly murdered somebody, and you're like, trying to be too cute, so you come to court on the day of your expected exoneration when the verdict is about to be read, and you're wearing a button-down shirt, and underneath you have the words, "I did it." Okay, and the verdict is read, "Not guilty." Ha ha! I got away with murder. Yeah. Double jeopardy, sorry, prosecution, you screwed up. You should have gotten the conviction, because double jeopardy rules would make that scenario, as absurd as that sounds, you could not try the person again for that murder once you're exonerated, okay? So that's what double jeopardy means. You cannot be tried twice for the same offense. Now, in the case of O.J. Simpson, he was sued in civil court. Now, why isn't that double jeopardy? Well, in civil court, you are not in jeopardy of life or limb. You are financially in jeopardy, but that's different. So civil court doesn't count against double jeopardy, just FYI. Okay, so Fifth Amendment rule, right against self-incrimination, right against double jeopardy. Also, don't forget, in the Fifth Amendment, you have a right to a grand jury, which is the only part of the Bill of Rights so far that has not yet been incorporated. A right to a grand jury is the right to, in a federal case, is the right to have a jury assembled for the purpose of considering evidence. It is a procedural hurdle that prosecutors must overcome before they can even try a case. And then the last part of the Fifth Amendment is you have a right to have property taken for public use without just compensation. I probably told this story before, but I used to do sound over at my old high school, and one year we came in and all of our microphones had been seized by the federal government. Not the microphones, the transmitter packs, because the federal government reassigned the bandwidth from 600 megahertz to 700 megahertz for use for cell phone companies. And we had several instances of wireless mics that were non-compliant with that. So They took them. But because of the Fifth Amendment, they paid for new ones that were in compliance, so we got, new inferior equipment, I might add, with the money. But anyway, that's a real-life example of the takings clause. Okay. Page 18, which of the following situations would the Supreme Court be most likely to utilize the doctrine of selective incorporation? And right off the bat, when an individual claims that a right protected by the Bill of Rights is infringed upon by a state, that's going to be your answer. Which of the following scenarios would be most likely considered a violation of the Fourth Amendment? A subject is interrogated without being informed of the right to an attorney. That's Sixth Amendment. Person is tried twice for the same offense. Which amendment? Fifth Amendment. Suspect's cell phone is analyzed by police before a warrant is issued. Fourth Amendment. That's the one. And by the way, with regard to that Fourth Amendment, I say my idea of recently, as I get older, I guess I need to stop saying that word. In 2009, the Supreme Court ruled that your cell phone is an area where you have a reasonable expectation of privacy, so the police cannot search your cell phone without a warrant. The Gideon case is the right to an attorney. Sixth Amendment right to an attorney. Let's go over the Sixth Amendment. The Sixth Amendment has a right to a speedy public trial by a jury of your peers. And by the way, speedy public trial is a relative term. Expect if you have a trial within a year of commission of a crime, that's like lightning speed in American terms. So speedy is a relative term. But they are public. Any courtroom in America, including the Supreme Court, is open to the public. You can go and sit in, and they do not have closed-door sessions to put people on trial. Okay, and the most important element of the Sixth Amendment is the right to an attorney. The right to an attorney was selectively incorporated to the states in the Gideon case. The Gideon case, once again, involved a kind of a poor, indigent, somewhat elderly, I used to say old man, and now I'm like almost his age, but anyway, he was in his late 50s, okay, so I'll give it that. And he was, identified by a single eyewitness at 5 o'clock in the morning as having broken into a billiard hall, pool hall or whatever, and for a nominal amount of money, like, less than $20. And for that, because of his prior convictions, he had a hard childhood, some juvenile delinquent offenses and stuff like that. Breaking and entering, nothing violent. He was sentenced to 5 years in jail. While in jail, he wrote a handwritten appeal claiming that his Sixth Amendment right to an attorney had been violated because he asked for a lawyer, and they said no, because at the time, under state law, they couldn't provide one. Well, that was ruled to be a violation of his due process rights under the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment says, nor shall any state deny to any person within its jurisdiction due process of law, deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. All right, and then right to privacy, Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade is one of the must-know cases, obviously. Just remember that it's not a right to an abortion, it's a right to privacy, which allows a woman to have an abortion if she so chooses in the first trimester. And again, just review that case. The trimester framework is important for your understanding of the case there. So, all right. And by the way, this is another example of that idea of substantive due process, where a fundamental right is recognized and it's applied to the states. 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, that's when we get into the Brown case and letter from a Birmingham jail. Okay, that's the one required reading that probably stands apart from all the others. Martin Luther King made a very passionate argument for what he termed creative tension, creating tension. And if you were in my class, you may recall me talking about this idea of inertia. Segregation wasn't going away. It was not going to go. People were perfectly content, in southern states to allow this totally racist, system to exist. And the only way to change it, according to Martin Luther King, was to force the issue. And of course, he did that through nonviolent protests like lunch counter sit-ins and stuff like that. So letter from a Birmingham jail basically makes that argument. And you need to associate that with the idea of social movements that can result in policy change. Okay. Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act and all that stuff. So let's go through those real quick. Obviously, Brown is a case that you'd already be familiar with. African-American girl was trying to go to the all-white school. She was denied admission because there was an African-American school in a community that had adopted segregation policies. And this was the court revisiting the separate but equal doctrine and concluding unanimously that separate but equal was no longer in any way, shape, or form consistent with the principle of equal protection of the law. And in fact, they said that separating people by race is expressly, inherently unequal. Which, by the way, was kind of the catalyst that really ignited the civil rights movement, culminating in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which identified certain classes of race that have been subject to discrimination, and it outlawed discrimination based on race. The civil rights, the Title IX is something you need to know. That is a law that equalized opportunities for women in college admissions and other things, specifically with regard to scholarship money. And really, any federally funded program had to be equal to what was being spent on men's programs. And the biggest, most noticeable impact of this, which, by the way, the College Board is aware of, so be careful in a question on this that you thoroughly read it. But women, because most sports money goes, scholarship money goes to football and basketball for men, that's a huge amount of money that has to be spent on an equal basis with women. So women's sports, there's no women's sports equivalent to the popularity of men's football and basketball, so there's a lot more opportunities for women in a lot of greater variety of sports. So just be aware of that effect of Title IX. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, we've talked a lot about, but just keep in mind, it was probably the single most important civil rights law in that it gave voice to people that previously were not able to vote. You know, we talk a lot about how segregation was popular at the time. Well, popular among whom? Among the electorate. Well, guess who's not in the electorate? People of color, because they were intimidated. Even though they had the right to vote under the 15th Amendment, they weren't practically able to vote in most southern states. The Voting Rights Act dramatically changed that. A couple things real quick. It established a list of states that had a past history of discrimination. If you were on that list, any change to your laws had to go before the federal courts in something called federal preclearance. That proved to be very effective, and so effective that in 2013, the state of Alabama tried to have a voter ID law. The Obama administration said, nope, you can't do that. It has a racially disparate impact. Alabama said, where's the racism? Where's the racism in 2013? Show me the racism in voting practices. And there was like, I got nothing. Obama had just been reelected. The court said, you know what? It's not constitutionally sound to use a formula to determine which states were discriminating based on a formula in 1961. So the preclearance rules, just like that, went away. And the critics of that are like, well, now they're just going to be able to be racist again. And the proponents of it were like, you should be happy the law worked and there's no evidence of discrimination. So there's a big difference of opinion on that case. Okay, and then affirmative action. Affirmative action are policies that use race as a means to correct for past discrimination. And of course, there's also problems with that, because what about the Equal Protection Clause? And the Bakke case is not a required case, but Ellen Bakke was a medical school student who sued the University of California because he was, in discovery, able to obtain records and academic records of all these applicants that were people of color that got in where he was not admitted, even though he had a higher MCAT score and higher grade point averages. And so the court said, yeah, you're right. And here's what you need to know about that. Racial quotas are constitutionally impermissible. So quotas are bad, says the court. But race can and probably should be used as one of many factors in determining college admissions. Okay? So, When they ask about it when you take the SAT, if you're a person of color, check off the box, be proud, because that probably is going to be something that might, potentially be in your favor when colleges are looking to recruit people in places like I grew up where there aren't any people of color naturally in the population. They recruit very heavily, and that's, they're allowed to. They should. Unit 4, page 22. All right. There are kind of 3 major concepts that we need to know about from Unit 4. And we'll go through them pretty quickly because I want to wrap up here. What time is it? We got half an hour. Okay. Yeah. All right. First of all, political socialization. You need to know what it is and how it occurs. Okay? Every society does this. As Americans, you are in this very class for reasons relating to political socialization, okay? You're supposed to be, at least have an understanding of what American values are. So what are the core American values? Individualism, free enterprise, equality of opportunity, not equity. Some people are trying to sell you on this concept of equity. Equity means that everybody gets the same in the end. Equality is everybody has the same opportunity. So, if you like watching NASCAR and your idea of having fun at a NASCAR event is watching every single car cross the finish line at exactly the same time, then go equity. But equality of opportunity is more like that competition that exists and everybody starts out the same. Now, obviously, not everybody has the same station in life. If you're born in the ghetto, in a bad part of town, poor parents that are drug addicts, yeah, it's going to be tough. But still, the idea is, in America, you can overcome that. At least you can try. Equality of opportunity. And then individualism. So a lot of people, question whether individualism is still a core value. Well, think of this. Didn't they just release class rank for you guys? Do you care about grades? Most people do. So, it's kind of ingrained in our culture that, we assign grades because there's a kind of competitiveness that exists. And here's my defense of individualism, okay? Without individualism, without profit motive, you don't have innovation. Individualism and the profit motive is wired into our constitutional DNA. Everybody with me? If you look at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 7, I think? I don't know. Anyway, it's in there somewhere. Congress expressly is given the power to issue patents and basically secure to inventors and authors exclusive profitability of their ideas and inventions. Why do we have that in our Constitution? Because we, as Americans, I feel like a preacher, I feel like a politician, we as Americans are proud innovators. No, but it's true though. There's a profit motive. It's okay to, capitalize on an idea. I think if you didn't have my class, if you had my class, you heard this story. I went to school with a woman who, her dad was an event planner, and she noticed that they always had these goofy, giant novelty scissors, but they would have these big scissors cutting a ribbon cutting ceremony, dedicating a building or something like that, and then somebody would sneak up with a little pair of actual scissors and cut the ribbon. And she's like, why don't you just make them actually cut? So she did some patent research, and lo and behold, nobody had patented extra large scissors. She's a multimillionaire. A multimillionaire because she patented extra large scissors that cuts. And stop and think about it. Every building in the city of Houston had one of these goofy ceremonies where they dedicate the building. Do you know how many buildings there are in Houston, let alone the rest of the country, let alone around the world? And so her company supplies these extra large scissors exclusively because that was her idea. That's pretty awesome that you can, have an idea as simple as that and, cash in. So anyway, individualism. All right. Cultural values and globalization, and some of these we should probably talk about. Family, school, peers. Okay, family is the number one influencer of a person's political socialization. But we also have other factors, family, friends, things like that, and globalization. Look around this room. There are people from all over the world. Those people bring with them different cultural attitudes that creep into American culture, and eventually some are adopted, some are rejected, but ultimately there's an impact. So globalization impacts our political socialization as well. Question, which of the following best scenarios best reflects the process of political socialization? A, an individual takes a civics course and develops opinions about politics. There you go. That's your answer. So you've taken my course. What opinions do you have about politics? Don't answer that. All right. Public opinion polling. You need to know that polling is only effective if there's a large sample size, if there is sufficient randomization, and if the questions are fairly asked. In other words, non-biased questions. So watch out for questions about polling. For example, a poll of Twitter users would be of limited value because it violates the principle of randomization. Okay, so if you want to increase the validity of a poll, I think this is actually one of the questions, and you're only reaching landline users, you would also want to reach out to cell phone users. And for some reason, despite all the technology that we have, polling is still really tough to do because people don't answer their phones. So anyway, all right. In a public opinion poll, page 23, a polling company used online survey tools to randomly contact respondents who did not have telephone lines in addition to contacting people over the phone. Which of the following best explains this decision? Well, the company wanted to ensure the sample of the population was truly random. D is your answer. In a public opinion poll of representative of a population, 1,200 people were asked to agree, disagree, or express neutrality towards the following statement. Statement A, the government should spend more money on welfare, 35%. Statement B, the government should spend more money to help the poor. Well, who doesn't want that? 60%. Which of the following accounts for the different results? The questions contained a difference in wording. People want to help the poor, but welfare, get a job, you know. You're sucking off the American public. You should get out there and get a job. So, but helping the poor, who doesn't want to do that? So difference in wording can make a big difference. Okay, explain the credibility and quality of claims based on public opinion data. Again, can we talk about that? Explain how ideologies of two major parties shape political debates. Okay. Democrats are more liberal, Republicans are more conservative. Shocking. Okay. Which of the following policies would an individual who identifies as a Democrat likely support? A, reducing regulations on Wall Street. Democrats, they want more regulations. Decreasing the role of the federal government to ensure access to health care. Democrats want to increase the role of the government, so it's not C. Increasing federal enforcement of immigration laws. No. How about strengthening anti-discrimination policies for married gay couples? There you go. It's right in the heart of those social issues that Democrats are all about. Okay. Explain how U.S. political culture values, attitudes, and beliefs. Okay, so we have and implementation of public policy influences the formation of goals, implementation of public policy over time. Let's go straight to the question. Which of the following sets of policies appears to be most influenced by a libertarian ideology? Okay. Actually, let's finish the outline and we'll go to that question. Describe different political ideologies. Okay, so liberals are more likely to favor government intervention, regulation of the marketplace. Conservative ideologies favor fewer regulations. Libertarians favor little or no regulation. And then explain how political ideologies vary on the government's role in regulating the marketplace. Okay, liberals are more about Keynesian economics, using the power of government to spend money, infuse money into the economy. So the stimulus checks that went out during COVID, even though Trump started it, that is more alignment with liberal viewpoints. Conservatives, market-based solutions. The supply side model. Liberals tend to think that areas of personal privacy extend further than conservative ideologies do. I don't know if that's really true, but they, certainly with support for abortion rights, there's no question there's a divide between Democrats and Republicans, so think about that. And then policy trends concerning level of government involvement in social issues reflect the success of conservative or liberal perspectives. All right, so let's look at the questions. Libertarians. Libertarians want to legalize the commercial sale of marijuana and reduce government spending on prisons. That's the answer, okay? And by the way, it is not because libertarians are drug addicted, fools who just, that's not the reason. It's a philosophical difference in the role of law enforcement. Most inner city people in prison, I don't say most, but a large percentage of them are there for drug crimes or drug-related crimes. If you legalize drugs, obviously there's still going to be people who use drugs. Probably going to still be illegal activity, but at least you're not clogging up the jails with people who have mental health problems, not as much as they have legal problems. So that's the libertarian viewpoint. Which of the following is an accurate comparison of conservative and liberal views? Okay, so let's go to the list. Conservatives, the federal government should have a stronger role in shaping education. No. How dare you educate our children? No, it's more that the state should do it. That's the real answer. Don't want no bureaucrats telling our kids how to think. Licensed gun owners should be permitted to open carry. What the heck? Licensed gun owners should be permitted to openly carry firearms in public. Is that a conservative viewpoint? That's a stereotypical conservative viewpoint. I'll give you that. Liberal, the federal government should not conduct background checks for gun purchases. That's not accurate at all. Racial and gender considerations should be taken into account to promote diversity in the workplace hiring decisions. No. Individuals should not rely on government for, there you go. Get yourself a job there, son. Rely on the government for your income. And then liberal, the government should be responsible for helping to improve the economic position of low-income people because that's the caring thing to do. I use this in class. If you didn't have my class, okay. You see a car drive up to an intersection where there's someone begging for money. The car drives away. The next car gets out, fishes around in their pocket, gives the dude $5. Who's the liberal? Who's the conservative? Who's the liberal? The second one. Yeah, the liberal's like, you poor soul. Here, go get yourself something. The conservative's like, give the guy $5. He's just going to be there tomorrow, and he's never going to learn. You should teach a man to fish, not give him a fish. That way he'll, eat for life. Okay, so that's the. It's true though. That's the attitude. It's okay. Unit 5. We're almost done. Can we do Unit 5 in 40 minutes? 20 minutes? We're going to have to. All right. Okay. You need to know the suffrage amendments. First of all, Unit 5 is about political participation. All right. Let's go through each of the suffrage amendments just real quick to make sure you know that you have to know these. I'm going to call out what the amendment is. You call out the number in unison on the count of 3. Are you ready? Here we go. You cannot discriminate by race in voting practices. 15th Amendment. I wasn't on the count of 3, but whatever. 18 to 21-year-olds can vote. 26th Amendment. No more poll taxes. 24th Amendment. People can vote for their senators now. 17th Amendment. Half of the population gained voting rights. 19th Amendment. Women could vote in 1919. Interesting enough, we just had the 100th year anniversary. So there you go. All right, models of voter behavior. You vote for a Republican because you're a rich business person. Rational choice. You vote for a Democrat because your mom votes Democrats, your grandma votes Democrats, and by God, I'm going to vote Democrat too. Party line, or what's the other one? Yeah, party line voting, that's the answer. Okay. You buy into the idea that if you vote for a candidate, they're going to cut your taxes because that's what they promised. Retrospective. You vote for Bill Clinton. I still believe in a place called hope. Prospective, hope and change. If you want to run for president, just talk about hope and change, you know. That's what Obama did. Oh, worked for Bill Clinton. You got to have hope. And there you go. So, all right. So make sure you know those. Party line, rational choice, retrospective, prospective. All right. Explain the roles that individual choice and state laws play in voter turnout in elections. Okay. This is, let's see. We talk about structural barriers. Yes. Structural barriers. Okay. Underline structural barriers in your outline. Any policy that has the effect of making it more difficult to vote is called a structural barrier. Weekday elections. People work during the weekday. It's harder to vote. So, how do you alleviate that structural barrier? Early voting. We don't have election day anymore. We have election month, or soon to be election season. We'll just, whenever you want to vote, give you a year, doesn't matter. No, it's, but typically there's, the idea of election day, that's far too restrictive. So early voting is pretty common nowadays. And by the way, the retort for anyone who's like claiming that voter IDs have a racially disparate impact, then it's like, yeah, okay. But first of all, there's all kinds of ways to prove your identity. They can bring a light bill, they can do this, they can do that. And we give you 3 stinking weeks to vote. So, that's kind of the people who are criticizing. And by the way, this is, not to make light of this, but in Georgia, the President of the United States referred to the Georgia election integrity law, which is what the proponents call it, as the Jim Crow 2.0, referring to an era where we had whites-only signs and, forced segregation of the races. Requiring voter ID is Jim Crow 2.0? Well, the reason they say that is because, and your practice questions somewhere in your packet reflect this. Somewhere. Yeah, page 33, okay? It is literally taught in this course, disparate impact, okay? That when you have an ID policy in a community of color where most people don't have an ID because they don't have a car, if you live in Chicago and New York City or even Philadelphia, any of those cities, Washington, D.C., where mass transit is readily available, there's really no reason for the average person to have a car, which it would be shocking because I'm guessing all of you here, how many of you carpool this morning, by the way? Who's our environmental warriors? Good for you. Okay. All the rest of you, single car, for shame. You should have gotten a ride. You are wasting valuable resource and polluting the atmosphere. No. But anyway, in big cities, they have mass transit. So, yes, there's a disparate impact. Let's look at this question. We have voters without a government ID. All voters, 1 in 10 Americans do not have a government ID. African Americans, 1 in 4. I don't know if this is accurate, by the way, but that's pretty extreme. Based on the infographic, which of the following claims would an opponent of state voter ID laws make? Voter ID laws are likely to decrease turnout among African American voters because they're less likely to have government-issued IDs. Yeah. So, I mean, that's the answer. Some of these other ones are kind of ridiculous. But anyway, based on the this is the question that'll, if you're a conservative-minded person, it's like, come on! Based on the infographic, which of the following strategies would a group seeking to increase turnout likely pursue? Lobby state legislatures to overturn voter ID policies. Okay, so forget about voter integrity. It's more important that every single person votes, regardless of anything. So, anyway, okay, let's move on. Now we're almost done. Describe linkage institutions. All right. Oh, I forgot one. Page 27. Demographic characteristics and political efficacy or engagement are used to predict the likelihood of individual voting. Factors influencing voter choice include party identification, ideological orientation, candidate characteristics, contemporary political issues, religious beliefs, and so forth. Okay, so candidate characteristics in particular, we have talked a lot about this idea of a candidate-centered campaign and how it frustrates the political parties because they can't always control who the candidates are. And so we'll talk more about that here in just a second, but that is certainly an issue. Political parties, interest groups, and social movements provide opportunities for people to participate and influence how people relate to government. So linkage institutions, this is an important thing to know. We have our policymaking institutions, Congress, the courts, the bureaucracy, the presidency, but linkage institutions in a republic, everybody listening? In a republic, something that connects the voters in some way or fashion to the policymakers, those are linkage institutions. So political parties, interest groups, an election could be a linkage institution. A political poll could be a linkage institution. The media, social media. Explain the function and impact of political parties on the electorate and the government. Okay, first of all, let's make a comparison. Political parties exist. The whole reason they exist is to find candidates, run for elected office, create an agenda, win, and implement the agenda. They have to win. Their success is predicated on winning. If they don't win, they're in something called the minority party. And if you're in the minority party, you know what you don't have? Power. You don't have committee assignments. You're not a, you're the ranking member. Now, how many of you saw when Darrell Issa was questioning the woman who kept pleading the fifth in my class? If you didn't take my class, I apologize. And the ranking member was like, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I have a statement. I have a statement I'd like to make, Mr. Chairman. And the other guy's like, we're adjourned. Mr. Chairman, you can't run a committee like this. That's the power of the majority versus the minority. If you're the ranking member, you are not in the majority and you are cut out of the picture. So, you know, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Talladega Nights. Anybody seen the movie Talladega Nights? Nobody? Oh, you have, okay. If you're not first, you're last. Okay. That is literally the case in American politics. If you ain't first, you're last. Because if you're the minority party, you don't have any power. Now, okay, as a senator, you should know this, you have some power. You can institute a hold. You can be Ted Cruz and do a filibuster, read Green Eggs and Ham. You have some power. But in the House, if you're not, you know, friends of Nancy and in the majority party, you are out of luck. Okay. Other things that parties do, mobilization and education of voters. What is mobilization? Voter registration drives, canvassing neighborhoods, getting them to the polling places. Creating the party platform. The party platform is the agenda. It is a published document that provides a political party the means to implement an agenda. And if they implement an agenda based on what the voters have voted for, they can claim, who knows what that's called, 2 words, starts with an E, an electoral mandate. They can claim an electoral mandate, which is permission to enact an agenda. Which of the following important functions of democracy would most likely be difficult without political parties? Eliminating corruption in the bureaucracy, educating the public about upcoming elections. Yep. There you go. Okay. How many have we got here? Oh. All right. How political parties change and adapt, critical elections, okay. And candidate-centered campaigns. Structural barriers, we already talked about structural barriers, that's good. Let's talk about interest groups. Unlike political parties, where success is predicated on winning, interest groups can try to influence an agenda regardless, and especially now with the Citizens United ruling, where they can raise unlimited amounts of money, spend unlimited amounts of money independently of the candidates. So interest groups really don't care who's in power as much as they care about trying to influence whoever wins. So lobbyists, and by the way, lobbying is a term that you'll almost certainly use if you get a question about interest groups. If you use the term lobbyist, include a parenthetical definition. Lobbyists are people who attempt to influence policy. So there's industry lobbyists, there's interest groups that lobby on their own set of beliefs or whatever. Just make sure you include a definition of what it is. Which of the following is a consequence of candidate-centered campaigns? Page 28. A, the electoral success of third-party candidates sharply increases. Parties tighten their control over candidate fundraising to ensure compliance with regulations. Candidates have less accountability for their positions because the importance of the party platform increases. Candidates' ability to appeal to voters can outweigh the importance of experience in policy positions. Okay, so it's going to be D. The Republican Party platform was not the reason people voted for Donald Trump in 2016. People voted for Donald Trump in 2016 because he's Donald Trump. I was tempted to use an expletive, but he's Donald. I mean, and by the way, fully aware, half of the country really doesn't like Donald Trump very much. But have you seen those MAGA rallies? There's clearly people that do like the guy, or at least like what he stands for. The Republican Party, and if you didn't have my class, maybe this is news to you. 2016 was Jeb Bush was supposed to win. He raised $140 million prior to the New Hampshire primary, and it was like nothing because Trump. And the Republican Party was like, whoa. That guy, no, that's not a Republican. We're about Mitt Romney types, that play the game, state governors. Those are the people that are going to be Republicans, not someone like Trump. But anyway, the people thought otherwise, which, by the way, illustrates the difficulty that political parties are having in campaigns, especially when you get a strong candidate like that. Let's talk invisible primary. What advantage did Trump have that year over every other candidate? He's got name recognition. So if you're going to run for president, the very first thing you have to do is establish name recognition. Winning the invisible primary means that you are winning the game in terms of name recognition, which allows greater fundraising, which gives you greater polling numbers because you can afford advertising, and then think about that debate stage before the general election in the primaries. You have all these candidates. Who's in the center? The person with the highest polling numbers and the most fundraising money. So that is winning the invisible primary. Okay. Explain how various political actors influence public policy, single issue. Okay, so just be aware, there's in the summaries, there's stuff on that. Just make sure there's a lot of different types of interest groups. This question, I think, is pretty indicative of what you're going to find. Page 29. Two interest groups are competing for influence in Congress. One group represents banking institutions, while the other advocates for consumer protections. A critic of the influence of interest groups would make which of the following claims? A, the interest group will nominate a slate of candidates for office to compete against each other. The consumer protection group will appeal only to Republican leaders. Okay. Absolute language, not the answer. The banking interest group likely has greater financial resources and access to policymakers than the consumer protection group. Yep. C is correct. And by the way, look, consumer protection group is prohibited by law from federal regulations from direct. When have we ever studied that? That's ridiculous. So again, if you haven't heard it before, a good test-taking strategy is to never, ever, ever choose the answer that has absolute language. Never mind. Okay, thank you. Okay, I used absolutely. How about this? Let me see if you get it this time. Okay, you should generally avoid answer choices that use absolute language. Is that better? Okay, just making sure. It takes, dry, never mind. Page 30. Explain how different processes work in U.S. congressional elections, open and closed primaries. We need to talk about that. We need to talk about, what else? Costs of elections. Federal legislation. Okay, so here we go. Home stretch. Almost done. Some states have open primaries. In an open primary state, members of either political party can participate in the primary. A primary election is an intra-party selection process where you're trying to narrow down a field of candidates to select not the winner, but a nominee. So winning a primary means you are the nominee of your party. And in an open primary, you are inviting anyone from the electorate to vote in your primary. Some states are weary of that, and they instead have what are called closed primaries, where you have to be a registered member of the party to vote in an election. A leading indicator, by the way, of how a swing state is trending, if it's a closed primary state, is people changing their voter registration. So there's been a couple of stories out there about Pennsylvania and Florida in particular, which are both closed primary states where Republicans are gaining in terms of voter registration. So, if I had to make a guess, I think things are looking good for Dr. Oz. If you don't know, Dr. Oz is running for the Senate in Pennsylvania, so following the lead of Donald Trump, but I would go so far as to say I don't think Dr. Oz has the same, Trumpiness. I suspect Dr. Oz is a rhino. I think he's running as a Republican when he's secretly not, but what do I know? Anyway, if you don't know who Dr. Oz is, look it up. You should know these things. All right. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002. Here we go. Campaign finance. This is one of the last topics, second to last topic. Money in politics is a bad mix. Nobody wants a political class that is bought and paid for by special interests. And yet, courtesy of the Supreme Court, in fact, I will lay the blame squarely on Justice Kennedy because he authored the opinion, corporations have First Amendment rights because free speech, is kind of important in a free country. And corporations share a lot of qualities as human beings, and corporations are nothing but, groups of people. So why shouldn't they have rights? Because they have billions and billions of dollars, and they can spend money to unduly influence our elections and, ruin our sense of democratic principles. But other than that, anyway, so I'm a little conflicted. I'm a big free speech guy, but I'm also like, who has $1 billion that they can just burn and not even notice? Or decide you want to buy Twitter someday, It's like, there was a political meme. It was like, well, if you want to have free speech, you can create your own free speech platform. So Elon Musk was like, or I could just buy it. Why not? Anyway, I think the fallout from that is going to be, we'll know eventually, but I think it's going to be interesting. All right, campaign finance. Here's what you absolutely must know. Prior to the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, there were all kinds of loopholes in campaign finance law. There's not a lot in the outline about the Federal Election Campaign Act. I wouldn't even worry about that, honestly. But outside of reporting requirements and contribution limits, most of the law had been overturned because it tried to limit spending. That's a First Amendment violation. And as a result, all of these groups were making these ads that prior to 2002, you couldn't tell. There would be a really nasty attack ad against, Al Gore or George W. Bush, and you didn't know who was paying for it because there wasn't any law that required, the disclosure of who was paying for the ad. So the single most important thing in the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act was the stand by your ad provision. So the stand by your ad provision means that a political ad paid for with hard money out of a campaign has to have at the end a tagline, I'm Donald Trump and I approve this message. Meaning that they know the message is there, that it's from the campaign, and the voters then, or the Center for American Progress paid for the contents of this advertising. Okay, so that sort of thing is the legacy of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. The attempt to limit voter confusion by saying you can't name candidates, think of the absurdity of that. A law that says you can't use a candidate's name in advertising. That is screaming First Amendment violation, and that was the provision that ultimately triggered the Citizens United case. And for those of you that didn't have my class, Citizens United is a group that was paid for with corporate funding that produced a film called Hillary the Movie, which the name in and of itself violated the campaign finance laws. And they wanted to release it right before the primaries in 2008 when Obama was running against Clinton. So Hillary the Movie was a hit piece against Hillary Clinton that would have helped Obama. And eventually the Republican candidate not having to face Hillary Clinton. But anyway, Citizens United sued the Federal Election Commission. So Citizens United versus FEC, the Federal Election Commission. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's kind of a First Amendment violation. But before they could get to the First Amendment, they had to determine, do corporations have First Amendment rights? Everybody paying attention? What's the answer? Yes. 5-4 ruling. Not a strong ruling, but a ruling nonetheless. Okay. Which, by the way, triggered what you see on page 32, which is the Sue Money cartoon, which the following best describes the message in the political cartoon. Contributions to special interests have undermined fair and competitive political campaigns. So, okay, and then the very last thing is to talk about the media as a linkage institution. Okay, traditionally there have been 3 roles of the media: gatekeeper, scorekeeper, and watchdog. The gatekeeper determining what stories get aired, the watchdog keeping government accountable, and the scorekeeper. Scorekeeper role in your outline is referred to as horse race journalism. That's a term they will probably test directly, using that exact language. Horse race journalism is when the focus of the media is constantly on who's ahead. And the problem with horse race journalism, and this is what you need to get in your notes, it is at the expense of depth of understanding. It's at the expense of, informing voters what they need to know about an upcoming election. And so there's a tendency, because the media is profit-driven, that needs to go in your notes, profit-driven, privately owned. Their concern is about eyeballs. They need viewership. If they don't have viewership, they go out of business. So unlike, 50 years ago, when the average family sat down and watched the news every day, and 70% of American households watch the news, with that kind of viewership, you can do some pretty good in-depth reporting. Now, there's so many competitors, there's a couple things that have happened. One, we have fragmented ourselves into all kinds of different, factions, for use a Madisonian term, and we have driven ourselves apart ideologically. There's no consensus on what the issues are. And furthermore, algorithms on social media keep feeding us more and more of what we want, which provides us, if you're liberal, you become more and more liberal. If you're a conservative, you become more and more conservative, because that's what happens when you have all of this diversity. And so people are not watching the same thing anymore. There's no sense of commonality. Okay, so that's the idea of increased media choices. And then the credibility of news. Trust in media is at an all-time low. If you ask a typical conservative audience, do you believe the mainstream media? They'll be like, no. And liberals, there's tend to be a liberal bias. They don't say that in your materials, but they say the bias is towards, profitability, which is, I guess, kind of true. But there's no question there's bias. And of course, that does lead to distrust in the media. Okay. Let's do the middle question, page 31. Which of the following describes the potential impact of the electorate when daily media coverage of elections focus mainly on the newest polling results? The electorate will be increasingly divided on partisan lines. The electorate will be less likely to turn out and vote on election day. The electorate will be more likely to have expanded knowledge of the electoral process. The electorate will be less able to accurately compare the policy platforms of the candidates running in the election. D. All right. How are we doing out there? This is what's called the proximity effect. Well, what do you think? Do we got this? Going to be okay? I didn't dismiss you yet. We still have all of these summaries to go through, so we are just getting, I'm just kidding. And for those of you that get this reference, please clap. Thank you, Jeb Bush, for that moment. And, oh no, in all seriousness, I really hope that, don't panic. You guys are fine. The fact that you're here, we're going to be good. We're going to be good. Just make sure if you haven't had a chance to read through those reviews, take a break tomorrow. Go to bed early. You're going to be good. 8 o'clock is our exam Monday morning.